Good evening, history lovers, and welcome back. Tonight, we are embarking on a deep journey into one of the ancient world's greatest mysteries, the story of Atlantis. What exactly was Atlantis? Was it a real civilization submerged in the dark depths of the sea? Or was it a myth created to impart a meaningful lesson? Furthermore, why has this story captivated humanity's imagination for over 2,000 years? From the writings of Plato to the centuries-long speculations, the tale of Atlantis has been told sometimes as a paradise destroyed by greed, sometimes as a divine warning, and sometimes as a hidden part of our forgotten history. Now we will explore the origins of this story together. So, let us begin. What do the ancient sources actually say, and how did this story become one of the most fascinating legends of all time? As always, I am curious where in the world you are and what time it is as you tune in tonight. Whether you are listening to this narrative as you drift off to sleep, or you are here to satisfy your interest in history, I am happy you are here. Now, without further ado, we begin this captivating journey. The story, as told, begins with a god guarding a quiet hill. According to the legend, a great island lay beyond a narrow strait. The elder sailors called this region the Pillars, where the deep blue waters of the ocean flowed and the winds carried a mix of cedar and salt. Right in the middle of the island was a small but charming elevation of vibrant rock covered in red earth. In this place lived a young woman named Plato. She was the last remaining member of her family and the silent guardian of her father's house. One day, Poseidon, the god of the seas, came upon her. Poseidon, in his admiration for this hill, engraved it upon his heart like a precious jewel that even the ocean could not reach. Then, with all his might, he took the place under his dominion. He arranged the lands in circular rings so that no one could pass through them without permission.
He dug 3 deep channels, extending from the hill to the shore, and filled them with salt water. In the spaces between these, he left solid ground to build palaces and place watchtowers. The craftsmanship was so flawless, it looked as though it had come from the hand of a master architect who had drawn the paths on the very first day. Viewed from the air, the island looked like the concentric rings formed by a stone dropped into the water. These structures, resembling perfect circles, had been settled upon the island with a god's determination. And in the middle of the innermost ring, Poseidon built a home for Plato. There he cultivated a dense wooded area. The shade it created was never absent, and the wind gently slipped through the leaves as if whispering the past. 2 springs gushed from beneath the rock, one hot, the other cold. The warm water steamed in the coolness of the blue mornings, offering peace to tired bodies at night. The cold spring was clear, sweet, and safe to drink. As years passed, those living in remote farms noticed that these springs improved the flavor of their bread and made their wine more durable. This was considered a small miracle that even the most skeptical people could accept. 10 male children were born from that marriage. Each was born as a pair. The eldest of these children was Atlas, a towering figure, solemn, and a leader whose voice resonated. Poseidon gave him direct dominion over the entire island and placed him first among his brothers. The ocean surrounding the sea was dedicated to his glory. The sailors who found their way trusting the stars and memory named these waters the Atlantic. Even after the god, had lapsed into silence. The god rewarded his other sons with separate lands and commanded them to show loyalty to their brother. They were to rule as princes, but they would bow to the words of the eldest and accept his obedience. This instruction, more than a law, was sealed by blood ties, and the future of the island would be shaped through this bond. The land responded to this beginning with a strange bounty that only an awakened mind could perceive. The lands irrigated by the rivers were dark and fertile. The soil under the shade of the pine trees was bright and sandy, but both types yielded generous produce. Fields of barley and wheat waved in the wind. Vines grew with robust trunks, displaying their fruits, and great bunches were full and sweet, overflowing the branches. Fig and apple trees produced enough fruit to fill baskets, while olive trees were a symbol of patience. The olive oil, obtained after years of labor, kept the lamps alive on winter nights. Forests extended over the highlands, providing straight timber from which even the longest beams could be cut, while reeds, rushes, and white stones were noticeable on the lower slopes. Cattle roamed vast pastures, finding grass even in the latest season of the year. Wild animals abounded in the forests, leaving their tracks on the banks of the streams. Old hunters told of great-tusked, clumsy but strong animals that opened paths for themselves by tearing down saplings. Whether their stories were true or not, this land was a shrine in itself. It demanded very little in return for all that it generously gave. Atlas and his brothers could have lived a modest life in such a fertile land.
For a time, they acted in this manner. They accepted the god's command not as permission, but as a responsibility. They built structures, first of wood and then of stone when needed. They established their homes near the central hill, using the rings as requested by the god, as a protection, a boundary, and also a tool to measure distance and remember whose safety they were ensuring. They crossed the waters in small boats, using poles and oars, navigating the placid canals. In the early years, they did not erect ostentatious walls. Instead, they built temples in the center. An area dedicated to Poseidon and his first love, Quieto, was created. But this area had neither gold nor a bronze roof. Yet the people brought the most valuable things they possessed: a carved beam depicting a god fishing, a bowl of lapis lazuli stone reflecting the morning light, or a ring made using a red metal extracted from the island's dark-veined stones. This metal glowed like embers and maintained its vivid color despite the salty air. Over time, people named this metal orichalcum and approached it with a reverence close to that they showed gold. In the beginning, the island was a source of miracle and hope. The island beneath their feet offered more than just resources like grain or timber. It was a bright promise for the future. However, Poseidon's sons were not sitting on the throne at that time. They served as regents under the rule of a father who was both compassionate and intimidating, like the tides. Atlas worked with reed pens on maps drawn on wood, while the other brothers brought reports concerning fields, cattle, and boats. Rings were drawn around the hill at the center of the maps. These lines were both an answer
and a question. How can we cross them while preserving their meaning? How can we open trade routes without causing harm? The brothers voiced their ideas in turn. Atlas listened to them all and decided where a new bridge should be built, or where the grove should grow untouched. With such small decisions, a realm began to take shape. In the early days, visitors came to the island one by one. A fisherman from a small island seeking new lands. A merchant carrying amber beads from the northern shores. Or a sailor claiming to have reached the end of the world and returned. However, easy access to the center of the island was not granted. They had to wait anchored in the outer ring. The guards behaved kindly, offering water from the cold spring and some bread. A child carried the message to the center and then returned with the reply. On some days, the answer was negative. It was a strict practice, but it ensured the silence of the hill was preserved. The people gradually understood that the center needed to be opened slowly, otherwise it could be lost. As a people who loved the sea, they respected the land above all else. Where the land was suitable, they opened fields in long, regular rectangles. Straight channels were dug parallel to the riverbeds, and the crops were watered using only the assistance of gravity. Fathers showed their sons how water flowed from one level to another. The sons learned the necessary knowledge to keep the channels clear of alluvial deposits and their sides strong. This process was not the work of a showy palace, but a simple and functional necessity.
This was work that passed diligently during the day and brought abundance to the tables at night. Yet it carried a quiet splendor within itself. When harvest time arrived, everyone gathered and emptied the first sacks of grain onto the temple floor. The sound resembled raindrops hitting the roof. Every year, the sea reminded them who they were and that they were a part of this world. In some months, the waves rose, and during those periods when the sea darkened, the harbors in the open sea became dangerous. Fishermen pulled their boats high onto the shore to protect them from the waves, and families listened to the roar of this natural force on the shore until the storm passed. When the storm ended, the sky cleared, and the island appeared washed and purified. The surrounding rings were still there. The springs, one hot and the other cold, continued to flow. After the storms, people walked barefoot to the outpost, treading on the wet earth, and gave thanks to the God that their island was still in place and had not withheld its blessings from them. The foundation of Atlantis was laid neither with rebellion nor violence. They were the representatives of a careful, conscious civilization. A god had drawn a secure border around the hill. A woman had built a home in her heart. And 10 sons had learned to love a realm not for glory or fame. A small city was taking shape near the shore, around the serenity of the central point. In this tranquility, the foundations of the future were being laid. Atlas wore his crown like a light full of power and wisdom.
The ground he stood on was the work of divine splendor and resolute hands. His task was to prevent the light from causing any harm. His initial actions were neither ostentatious nor excessive. He established laws and provided a rhythm for the community. He summoned his brothers to the center and restated the known truths. Each would govern their own regions, undertaking their own obligations. They would meet together to reach judgment, with transparency as the basis, rather than humble flattery. They would take their discussions to the temple, and when they departed, their egos would be tempered and their duties clarified. The slow but steady development of the island was shaped in this way. The city and its surrounding rings began to grow in a manner that would satisfy both architects and sailors. The waterways here were not merely a display of divine power, but also solutions for the needs of practical life. By Atlas's command, bridges were built over the narrowest openings. Thus, chariots and cattle could easily cross the long, winding paths between the land masses. He ordered the opening of a wide channel extending from the outermost ring to the open sea. This would allow high-prowed ships to easily reach the calm waters behind the walls during the tide. The canal followed a dead straight line, and its depth was regularly maintained by the crew who knew the art of reading the mud. Drawbridges, designed to be lifted in case of trouble, were placed in the inner rings.
The harbor functioned like the lifeblood of the city. The comings and goings of the ships resembled the breathing of the city. Soon, the stones determined the character of the city. 3 elegant colors were obtained from the quarries. The builders laid white stone where the sunlight would strike. Red stones were placed in strips along the arches and lintels. Durable black stones were placed at the bases of the foundations and where they would be exposed to water splashing. The walls of the 3 great rings were covered with various metals. The outer wall shone with polished, gleaming bronze. The middle wall radiated a pale, tin-like brightness. The innermost wall, covered with orichalcum by the masters, reflected the sun like fire sparks. There was no consensus on what orichalcum was. Some thought it was a metal in its own right, while others argued it was an alloy created by masters from different metals. However, these debates were not important in Atlantis. This material they possessed endured the sea air and attracted attention by reflecting the sun like the horizon in the twilight atmosphere. In the innermost ring, a great temple dedicated to Poseidon and Plato rose. The temple was magnificent enough to make one feel small, yet not so large as to lose its sacredness. Its columns were covered with red metal sheets. The roof, thanks to the pale metal plates beneath the tiles, radiated a graceful light at sunrise. The floor was paved with old white stones containing blue veins. The statue of the god was located in the vault of the temple.
In the statue of Poseidon, the god held a trident in one hand, with his war chariot and 4 horses behind him and on his head. The horses appeared to be in motion, and the sea seemed to come alive, participating in a static dance with them. The foot of the god was surrounded by bas reliefs detailing
how his brothers took control of their lands. Cleito, standing beside him, was sculpted with her hand raised in a gesture of blessing. When the torches were lit, the gold leaves on the bas-reliefs shone like a burning flame. Atlas commanded that the laws be inscribed on one of the orichalcum pillars. This column carried not only the words, but also the honor and respect of the island. 10 kings would convene every 6 and 5 years, traditionally wearing crowns made of branches cut from the sacred grove. Just as they had inherited from their ancestors, they would hunt a bull in the palace. The animal they chose had to be strong enough to break a man's bones. They would not accept ordinary stable animals. Swearing by the god, the pillar, and the spilled bull's blood, they promised to be fair, loyal, and to punish any king who violated the law. The smell of warm blood and the salty, acrid sharpness of burnt meat were etched into my mind. There were 2 springs nearby. One gently steamed in the cool air, but the other was so cold that when I touched it, I felt my hand go numb. These memories left a deep impression on my memory. A man who once stood there had not forgotten his promise. A plane taking off from a point far from the city carried all the weight of this realm on its back.
Atlas, aiming to ensure that water was used productively without waste, had his engineers map the river like a game board. Straight channels were dug to transport wood from the mountains and grain from the fields to the harbor. Simple sluice gates were placed in the river, allowing barges to operate easily and to be controlled with pole boats. Long rectangular fields were arranged with earthen dikes to collect floodwaters during the rainy months and release them in a controlled manner during dry days. Herds grazed in measured common areas, and the forests were shaped according to strict rules. So much so that timber could not be obtained for the construction of a palace until twice the number of saplings were planted to replace every tree cut down. This was a system based on practice rather than belief. Within a single generation, this law restored ecological balance. The central regions of the island contained enough metal and stone for many plans to be realized. Miners extracted copper, tin, and the hard black stone known for its durability from deep veins. They also obtained the red metal, highly prized by jewelers and armorers from the depths of the earth. This rare metal was initially dedicated to temples, pillars, and the inner defensive walls, and then spread throughout the fabric of the city. If you walked through the marketplace at noon, you could notice the red glint in the rings and buckles used by the people, on the rims of bowls, the fittings of scabbards, or the nails securing the bows of ships to the ribs. The blacksmiths, while teaching their apprentices how to heat and fold the metal, specifically showed them ways to prevent this red metal from cracking with changes in weather. When the first storms of the season battered the harbor, these connections withstood all difficulties.
Atlas made it a law that certain amounts of the first yield of the grape harvest and grain should be brought to the region. Thanks to this law, the temple always remained full, and people began to view the harvest not just as individual success, but as communal wealth. Festivals reinforced this understanding, celebrating the common heritage and keeping respect alive without casting the shadow of fear. On special days, people poured bowls of hot and cold water at the gods' feet, offering praises for both peace and a sharp mind. During the ship festival, the harbor entrances were adorned with garlands, and old oarsmen would sit in the boats with an enthusiasm reminiscent of days gone by. As children beat the shields to keep the rhythm, the harmony of the past and the present could be felt. On the day of the laws, the pillars were polished, made clean enough to reflect one's face. A tradition was maintained where the kings recited ancient verses, reviving the echo of justice. People who seemed to have forgotten their power could sense the order woven into the fabric of the palace and notice the small details. Although this early period of governance was not directly concerned with warfare, preparation was an unavoidable reality. A wide water ring near the outer walls served as a hippodrome for training chariots. Here, teams honed their skills in fierce races. On the plain beyond the walls, companies drilled with spears and shields clashed. The ships in the harbor were kept in enclosed shelters, carved into the stone to protect them from the destructive effects of time. Captains kept detailed inventories of each ship, noting which crews were missing or which boats needed urgent repairs. However, all this silent preparation did not lead to a false conclusion. Those who protected the peace were the ones prepared for every situation that could disrupt its delicate balance. The roots of wealth had already begun to weave into the fabric of the kingdom. The granaries and warehouses were full of provisions against days of scarcity, with a share set aside from every harvest. The coins minted in the kingdom's mints were carefully engraved with the head of Poseidon or pillar designs. With tributes arriving from neighboring provinces, the island had become a powerful trade center, and valuable goods like amber and tin had begun to reach its shores. Before dawn, while fine linen fabrics and incense arrived from warmer lands, the island offered timber, quality craftsmanship, and reliable harbor services in return. This commercial balance was meticulously preserved and measured. Yet above all else, stability and moderation prevailed within the community. The kings still carried out their judicial duties in simple woolen garments, symbolizing this balance. Atlas kept his house in the inner ring wide enough for both work and hosting guests, but this house was not so large as to overshadow the presence of a nearby temple. When a prince from a distant land sent an expensive gift, the High King would set aside a portion of it for the region or the shipyards. The priests kept their bodies lean, but their eyes sharp and vigilant.
Artisans in the region were honored by name when they solved complex problems related to weight or water. Farmers who built a new terrace were also mentioned in these ceremonies.
The populace learned what the kingdom valued and shaped their lives accordingly. In the stories told, there were signs and small miracles that remained in people's minds. On the longest day of the year, spring would increase the mildness of the midday warmth a little more, while the cold springs would make their cooler air felt in the evenings. Old women would say that these were the gods' ways of speaking in a silent language. That same summer, a great school of fish came into a pool of water and remained there for 3 days. Children would lean over the railings to watch the slow movements of the fish. The soldiers jested with pleasure, saying, "Even the fish grasped the meaning of the walls." Then a good harvest season followed. People nodded and offered their thanks for this situation, but no one attempted to extract grand meanings from it. Such years made people think they were doing the right things. Perhaps they truly were. The island under Atlas was proceeding on a stable path. The effect of the laws was felt, and the skills of the engineers were respected. The priests always remembered that they were servants. Wealth reached the places where it was needed. The temple was magnificent, but not dazzling. When visitors to the city wondered how this order was achieved, the elders would point to the pillars and stone rings of the temple, explaining the importance of not forgetting your center and of keeping the paths leading to it clean and safe.
The ringed city grew not by chance, but with meticulous care. The city was growing like a master stonemason, carefully weaving his rows and not forgetting the alignment. The sea had already drawn the first rings. Atlas and his team had worked the stone and wood to make the rings feel like the ribs of a living organism. A wide canal was dug in the outer regions. This channel cut through the true sand to reach the ocean. The canal was straight and deep, and the paths were marked with stone signs. Thus, a level-headed captain could find the correct route in foggy weather. The entrance to the canal was so wide that 2 merchant ships could pass side by side. Tides and currents took on the heavy work, while the crew handled the remaining tasks using poles and ropes. The canal extended to the docks surrounding the harbor steps located in the first ring of water. Sailors learned to love that harbor over time. The frightening waves of the open sea calmed down thanks to the presence of the rings, and boats moving around the city could navigate easily. Over the water rings, the king built solid bridges with wide spans. These bridges were covered with black stones that were unaffected by water splashes. The railings were made of polished, bright bronze material. A person walking from the outer ring to the inner ring could feel the city enveloping them with every step. As they approached the center of the city, they encountered drawbridges. These bridges could be raised in as short a time as a cavalryman galloping between patrols. In times of peace, the bridges remained down, but in difficult times, they would be opened to widen the water barrier again. The 3 great walls stood out with their solid structures, bearing the pride of the city. On the outermost wall, there were bronze plaques that seemed aligned when touched. In the sunlight, these plaques turned into a warm band in the morning and evening. The surface of the next wall had a dull appearance at midday, but took on the color of the sky at twilight. This wall was adorned with tin coatings.
The innermost wall was made of a bright and striking red metal, the kind that travelers would not soon forget. These plaques were placed on quality stones and secured with copper clamps. The joints of the stones were so precisely worked that not even the tip of the thinnest knife could fit between them. Guards patrolled on tile-covered paths that provided shelter from the rain. Stairs carved into the thickness of the walls provided access to the bridges or to the gates opening to important keys. It was possible to move men on these stairs faster than the speed of a trumpet sound. The stones used in the construction were brought from the island and blended with 3 different tones: white blocks from a quarry near the river bend, red stones from the low hills in the north, and black stones from a bed that extended to the coast. The stonemasons placed these stones in the courtyards and porticos to create distinct yet understated colored strips. The streets of the city were arranged with the same care. The main roads drew slight curves to connect with the bridges. Smaller side streets intersected the rings of the terrain at right angles. Canals flowing beneath these roads were designed to direct rainwater to the sea. Thanks to these channels, water quickly drained during heavy rains, neither accumulating in the streets nor rotting the trees and spoiling the market air. The inner ring, the most special area within the city, housed the heart of the kingdom. The surroundings of Poseidon and Clito filled the eye with a simple yet impressive magnificence. In the dimness inside, the glitter of ivory and gold stood out. The imposing statue of the sea god rose above a pool illuminated by reflections from oil lamps. He held his trident and commanded a war chariot with his horses that seemed to be rising from the waves.
The base of the pedestal was adorned by metal workers with a strip of bright red plates that did not fade no matter how much light burned in front of them. The roof beams were made of cedar wood, shaped by carpenters over years of labor. The columns were decorated with meticulously carved dolphins, bulls, grain, and vine motifs. The stones forming the floor were laid with subtle craftsmanship to guide the visitor step by step into the presence of the god. So much so that one would find oneself bowing before the god without realizing it. In the vicinity of the region, courtrooms and banquet halls, located in the palace district where people met in open courtyards on market days, were connected by colonnaded walkways. The assembly rooms were carefully designed and positioned to allow for transitions between them, so that people could carry out their daily business smoothly and regularly. The palace looked like a fortress, but it was not. The strength of the walls came not from their thickness, but from the solidity of their structure. The builder's strategy was based not on the military, but on the justice of the people and functioning laws. It was the water system that brought peace to the city. Fine channels from the hot springs and cold water sources near the central hill were skillfully used to carry clean water to the baths and fountains. Hot water channels reached the baths used by tired workers at the end of the day to relax, and by officials to soothe their aching bodies after training. The cold water was the source for public fountains and irrigation systems that flowed constantly. In summer, these fountains cooled children and the elderly, while in winter, the steam rising from the baths warmed the streets and softened the wind. City officials kept detailed records with the names of every valve and pipeline written down. When a pipeline or section needed cleaning, teams would arrive with brushes and poles before the homeowner could finish their complaint. Furthermore, ship hangars were meticulously carved into the stone cliffs. These hangars provided an ideal environment for the ships to rest without damage and prepare for the new season.
Hinged doors opened directly onto the water and closed tightly to prevent saltwater splashes. Long measuring strips were available for rope makers, and they could easily do their work in these areas. Sail makers worked in courtyards wide enough to lay the canvas flat. Carpenters had carefully recorded the stocks of dry timber to be used in case the ship's keel cracked or the ribs were damaged. The Navy was a part of daily life, not a spectacle or a ceremony. A visitor could see this in the behavior of the soldiers and in the lists carved into the timber of the barracks. The outermost ring housed the markets. Fish were displayed on wet stalls, channeled into the canal by gravity. Grains packed into sacks were transported here from the fields by barges. Potters could be seen stacking jars taller than a person. Blacksmiths sold nails by weight and assessed the value of knives by touch. Jewelers displayed ornaments made of red metals, explaining to customers how their color remained vibrant even in the sea. Awnings were set up over the market stalls to cover them and mitigate the effect of the sun. The area was teeming with young people working for bread and a diluted glass of wine. Theft was never tolerated. Guards sought to maintain order with a determination that viewed violence only as a last resort. There were also special places for horses. The wide water ring closest to the wall was partly a track for horses. Here, a horse and chariot were trained, learning how to turn smoothly without skidding their wheels. The stables were built in places where winds blew to keep flies away. Grooms monitored the feed, checked the gates, and regularly recorded the harness equipment. Those who succeeded in inspections held during specific periods earned the right to wear a badge marked with the king's coat of arms and could participate in competitions held during festivals. The same order prevailed in the agricultural areas outside the inner ring. Canals were woven like a net to bring water within reach of every field.
Barges carried timber from the mountains and produce from the farms. Willow trees were planted to hold the nearby banks in place. The lock mechanisms were simple but highly functional. Double doors, sluices, and a chain used when necessary were key to repairs. The road along the main canal was built high enough to remain dry even in rainy weather. The stone-reinforced roads with regularly paved edges left no tracks where chariots passed, and travelers could move at an incredible speed compared to the muddy riverbanks and mountain paths of the countryside. While the city was being beautified, precaution was never overlooked. Guard officers checked the lamps at every point as they patrolled the walls.
Fire watchmen in the palace district were always vigilant. Buckets and hooks were kept ready, and drills were performed in their spare time. The marker pole in the harbor carried flags to indicate to captains whether the inner bridges were open or the docks were full. A ship arriving at sunrise would learn where to find fresh water by noon and where to spend the night. The kings knew the value of such foresight. It eased tensions, saved money, and sometimes even saved lives. Even if incoming visitors did not consciously notice this captivating order, they could feel it. The rings created an established rhythm, weaving a sense of order into every moment. You ate, traded, prayed, trained in specifically designated areas, and slept. No one needed to shout or explain. The order itself told the whole story. When a farmer brought his olives to the press, he could learn the route, the price, and the time before even leaving the door. When a captain approached the canal with his ship, he could grasp the width of the passage even before passing the bronze plaques of the walls. A stranger standing in the center of the city and looking outward could inwardly understand how this place achieved its wealth and power. It was a captivating experience.
The glory of Atlantis was shaped not by excess, but by a sense of precision and moderation that facilitated work. Perhaps those who built these stones and bridges did not think of pride during their work, but when you stopped and looked after the labor, pride emerged spontaneously. When a city was in harmony with its shape, and the gold on its walls reflected not just breed, but the light of the sun, pride grew quietly and deepened. The value of a city was understood by seeing what happened in the morning hours. In Atlantis, the morning belonged to the harbor. Before the sun had even passed the outer walls, children cleaned the harbor quays with their brooms and baskets. Scribes sat at the entrances of the gates with their tablets, keeping records with their reed pens. Even a philosophical discipline was discernible under the dimly lit lanterns. The names of ships and captains were taken, and the cargo was meticulously sorted. Timber and pitch in one place, grain and olives in another, and salted fish on a separate line. Dockmasters stood at the head of each pier with rods attached to whistles, ensuring that ships moored in their correct places. When the cargo was unloaded, barrels were counted one by one. The order of the city was like a mind that thought with its hands. Every movement completed a harmony. Then the market would come alive. Fishermen displayed their catch by size and species. As the air carried the clean scent of the sea, the stalls in the marketplace began to fill with coins. When bakers broke the crusts of the first breads, the steam rolled up their sleeves and left an exquisite taste on the palate.
The variety of bread changed according to the season. If there was scarcity, it was made from barley. If the harvest was abundant, wheat was preferred. Bread paired with olives or cheese collected from the foothills of the mountains took its place on the tables. Small jars of vinegar were found on the stalls, and men dipped pieces of bread into the vinegar to curb their hunger. Women haggled hard for copper needles and plain earthenware pots. Children chased each other in the colonnaded walkways and wandered there until the grocer got annoyed and sent them to a safe place outside to play.
A little further away, blacksmiths drew the first light of the day from their bellows. The dry rattling from the coal gave way to the powerful roar of the bellows. The best forges were famous for their old craftsmanship. The subtle red tone on the door fittings and latches carried traces of the past. A foreman would walk along the shore, leaning on the tether of a mule. The bargeman would carry a pole to check the depth and keep a rake ready to clear weeds at the bends. During dry periods, the water in the canals was constantly kept balanced, with water being taken from one point and transferred to another. Canal managers prided themselves on successfully establishing a system that could deliver timber directly from the hills to the ship hangars. They would not allow even a single log to roll in the wrong direction. The law was not merely words uttered by an orator, but an order shaped by the steps in an individual's life. Courts were established in the inner ring of the city, in spacious halls beneath the columned structures. A citizen with a complaint could come here and convey his wishes to the clerics, marking the accusations and names. Judges were chosen by the kings, but they owed their honor neither to their personal interests nor to their purses. This honor was bound to the pillars and the laws.
Punishments generally involved a payment of money or a few days of work on public projects. However, a repeated offense could lead to more severe consequences, sometimes inevitably resulting in exile. People feared exile more than flogging because once exiled, a person lost not only their home, but also the meaning provided by the order of work and prayer woven into their life. This fear kept the community in order and peace more effectively than any weapon. The reigns of the kings were subject to specific rules. At regular intervals, every 6 and 5 years, they would walk toward the temple in simple robes and with green crowns on their foreheads. They were required to hunt a bull in the inner region. This was not a show of violence, but a ceremony where their loyalty and stance in governance were tested. Afterward, they would swear on the stones soaked with the bull's blood, promising to abide by the laws inscribed on the red pillar, and to judge even their own brothers if necessary. A king who violated the law would have to pay the price with both his honor and a part of his lands. Rumors suggest that such incidents occurred more than once. The society of Atlantis learned early on that leaving the powerful unaccountable for their mistakes was the shortest path to decay. Days were not limited only to work and administration. The calendar maintained its own rhythm. On the day when the ships were honored, colorful flags were hung on the outer walls, and a procession of the crew would pass through the city streets with oars held upright on their shoulders. When the day of celebrating the springs arrived, the people would carry their pitchers from the 2 different fountains to the steps of the temple, filling them so that steam would rise
in the morning light. When the game day arrived, the wide water ring near the wall was transformed into a racetrack. 2-horse chariots were driven on the adjacent path, with teams changing positions like birds soaring in the sky. Wrestlers gave their struggle on the packed earth, their shoulders glimmering with oil. Runners circled the track until the spectators encouraged the winner with great enthusiasm to touch the pillar.
The prize could be a wreath, a cup, or a place at the king's table. However, honor was always more valuable than the prize itself. Training was seen as an ordinary duty. Children learned letters and numbers in rooms cooled by the sea breeze. They were expected to work on drawing the arrangement of the rings on wax tablets until they could do it even with their eyes closed. They memorized the names of the winds and learned how to analyze the value of a harbor based on the direction of the current and the color of the water. Sons of shipbuilders could distinguish the type of wood by the difference in the sound produced when struck by a mallet, while daughters of merchants could calculate and instantly detect an incorrect weight. Priests transmitted the ancient hymns and stories etched into the depths of the city. Sailors showed the youth how to find the North Star and how to determine the course when the sky was cloudy. The home was considered the heart of the city. Most houses were built with a small cistern arranged around a courtyard. The floor was packed clay in poorer households, but stone in houses built for the elderly. A house could accommodate 3 generations under the same roof. A weaving loom was found in a cool corner, and a mortar stood right at the entrance. In the cool morning, a wife or daughter would be busy grinding grain. On the shelves, one could find cups, a lamp, and a small figure of Poseidon, or a household spirit. When a child was born, the father would place a dish of honey next to the small altar, wishing a strong back and an easy life for his offspring. When someone died, the family would wash the body with water taken from the cold spring and keep watch throughout the night, telling stories that recalled their laughter and their deeds. Meals were simple but satisfying. Fish and barley bread were staples on the daily table.
On luckier days, goat or kid stewed with onions and herbs might be served, and after festivals, a share of the sacrificial meat would be distributed to the people. After all, this meat reached both God and man. Oil and figs elevated the taste of life. Wine was usually diluted, while the strong version was preferred for special occasions. Salt was obtained from flat pans beyond the fields. Honey was produced in hives nourished by the scent of thyme and sage gathered from the sunny slopes. A visitor who stayed on the island for a week would feel as though they had learned how tables were enriched here without wasting anything. Crafts added grace to Atlantis. Potters worked with a special type of clay that fired to a matte sheen and produced a red color that did not run. Engravers worked the black stones with such delicacy that they created seals that, when pressed into wax, allowed you to see even the details of a ship's planks. Weavers wove durable fabrics for sails and soft fabrics for robes, preparing colorful decorations that allowed families to be recognized from afar. Earnings were carefully invested in such skilled work. Kings never dressed as simply as peasants. They preferred plainer but elegant clothes. They used the red metal in rings or collars in a way that evoked a noble feeling rather than attracting attention. A palace governed by such finesse could sustain its existence in abundance for many years without losing its mind. The navy and the army were not burdens that consumed the city's resources, but building blocks that supported other professions. Shipbuilders mastered the art of measurement and transfer. Sails were matched by weight, carefully folded, salted, and tightly stored. Captains taught their crews to keep time with songs so as not to break the rhythm of the strokes in wavy waters.
On luckier days, goat or kid stewed with onions and herbs might be served, and after festivals, a share of the sacrificial meat would be distributed to the people. After all, this meat reached both God and man. Oil and figs elevated the taste of life. Wine was usually diluted, while the strong version was preferred for special occasions. Salt was obtained from flat pans beyond the fields. Honey was produced in hives, nourished by the scent of thyme and sage, gathered from the sunny slopes. A visitor who stayed on the island for a week would feel as though they had learned how tables were enriched here without wasting anything. Crafts added grace to Atlantis. Potters worked with a special type of clay that fired to a matte sheen and produced a red color that did not run. Engravers worked the black stones with such delicacy that they created seals that, when pressed into wax, allowed you to see even the details of a ship's planks. Weavers wove durable fabrics for sails and soft fabrics for robes, preparing colorful decorations that allowed families to be recognized from afar. Earnings were carefully invested in such skilled work. Kings never dressed as simply as peasants. They preferred plainer but elegant clothes. They used the red metal in rings or collars in a way that evoked a noble feeling rather than attracting attention. A palace governed by such finesse could sustain its existence in abundance for many years without losing its mind. The navy and the army were not burdens that consumed the city's resources, but building blocks that supported other professions. Shipbuilders mastered the art of measurement and transfer. Sails were matched by weight, carefully folded, salted, and tightly stored. Captains taught their crews to keep time with songs so as not to break the rhythm of the strokes in wavy waters.
On land, soldiers, tired after the harvest, would withdraw to the fields to rest. They would return to their homes when the season changed. Spears were protected on racks under the eaves, with their tips pointing toward the ground. Shields were hung on the walls. A city that could build a wooden wall in a single day could earn respect without having to fight. Foreigners were both welcomed with hospitality and governed with justice. Guest houses were located near the outer ring of the city and were kept constantly clean. Translators and scribes sat at the gates, earning their living with their language skills. Customs regulations did not take more than a fair share. A cheating captain might have to return home with his ship sealed, deprived of his cargo. An honest merchant could conclude the day with a clean ledger and a glass of wine. Many people returned simply for the assurance provided by the order. Whether on an ordinary day or at a festival, by keeping your word, you could create a reputation more valuable than gold. Of course, not everything was perfect. Pride was hidden in small choices. For instance, a merchant wore a second ring. A judge condoned his son's skipping of drills without reason. A prince ordered more red metal than necessary to be used in the soldiers' harnesses. One of the palace singers praised the king's decisions through hymns as being superior to those of the god. These were not considered crimes, but each one created a noticeable weight. A people who had never been bent could perceive that this heavy burden began to increase over time. There were also moments that recalled the feeling of compassion. On a hot summer night, dolphins swam along the canal to the first ring, enjoying the waters until the lantern lights danced on their backs. The next morning, a cool spring breeze felt sweeter than usual. That day, an old woman walking in the courtyard swore she felt the hand of God on her shoulder.
On the night of the shortest day, a storm cloud, rising like a solitary pillar over the temple, poured its rain only onto the surrounding stones. A priest raised his head and said, "The God keeps us clean when we cannot protect ourselves." The people silently nodded their agreement to these words. Then they returned home and mended their nets. When the day was over, the city settled into sleep with the same meticulousness with which it had awakened. The gates of the inner bridges had closed, and the guards were lighting the lamps on the railings. Scribes neatly stacked their tablets, covered them with linen cloth, and weighted their corners with small stones. Children washed their hands in a basin of water and stretched out on the mats laid next to the cool wall, asking one last question before falling asleep. Priests lit the fires in the temple, leaving only a single lamp to be presented before the god. The city air was mingled with the steam from the baths, the salty scent of the sea from afar, and the aroma of freshly crushed grapes from a wine shop that had not yet closed on a corner. This pleasant scent carried both diligence and honor, as well as the sweet fatigue that followed it all. Life progressed with such a rhythm, born from the cycle of the rings, the order of the laws, and the bounty of the springs. There was a city here that believed in its own order and its slowly rising virtues. Silence was their pride, and perhaps the real danger was hidden here, because it was not understood while they lived within that pride. The downfall came silently, unnoticed,
like the changing of the tides when one looked elsewhere. A new generation had grown up, who did not remember the arduous labor of the first canals, or the harsh winters when olives were counted one by one. Those who did not believe in the power of the sacred groves were increasing in number, and the fear of the gods was beginning to fade. Renewed laws carried doubt about the power of the springs, and ancient folk tales became less believable.
They had seen only fertile lands, the wealth of glittering metals, and a city subject to them, even before asking their questions. When people live in peace for a long time, they begin to believe that comfort on earth is eternal. And this city began to offer these people more than its own light. Everything beautiful became magnificent. The bronze coatings on the city's outer walls were constantly polished, and every week they were made so flawless that one could see their reflections in the keys. The tin of the middle wall shone with a pale fire under the midday sun. The red metal plaques, on the other hand, captured the sunset and reflected it back like stoked embers. In the wealthier neighborhoods, people learned to imitate this display. Even a craftsman who once lived only with white stone contemplated putting a strip of red metal on his lintel. Judges began ordering bronze finials for their stair rails. A prince ordered red metal coatings for his shields because he liked how the light flowed over the edges of the shield he turned in his hand. Palace feasts now lasted longer. Previously, a fine meal was eaten after the courts, and the singers were sent away before midnight. Because the palace did not fail to remember that it was a place of work, however, these traditions also turned into memories over time. As the hour grew late, the spirit of the time had begun to change. Musicians learned songs praising the king and exalting his name, while the food served at the tables now came from distant shores. However, these dishes were notable for their resistance to distance, their flavor not being very impressive. Feasts in the city offered roasted birds that would be hard to find even 10 days' journey away, and dishes made from fish caught in warm seas far beyond the island's waters.
The younger generation, who had never known hunger, had learned to mock the priests who preached self-restraint. These preachings, which they called restraint of virtue, for the tables of the poor, were found ridiculous. On the other hand, the method of hunting was also transforming. Kings still swore on the pillars by sacrificing bulls from the region, but these animals came less and less from the wilderness. Now, a wealthy prince would raise a beautiful animal and bring it to the palace for its symbolic value. The memory of the elders, however, was still fresh with the days when the old king had bloodstains on his wrists and dust residue on his teeth even before his oath. In the past, the blood flowing on the stones was remembered as carrying the scent of hunting feasts, not fear. Priests whispered among themselves how symbols warmed when earned and cooled when bought.
The laws continued to be written on the red pillars, but flexibility began to appear in their application. A judge, once known for his strictness, now generated reasons to postpone decisions that suited the interests of a noble dynasty. Fines used to repair the streets and roads in the city were now forgiven with a slight smile. A foreign sea captain, found to have skimmed weight while bringing products favored by the palace, such as incense, would escape with a symbolic fine. People accepted that small mistakes could be tolerated as long as they served a larger purpose. But they had not yet realized how quickly these small mistakes turned into customs. Thus, wealth had begun to pass into different hands through new ways.
The money circulated from hand to hand, finding its place in solid coffers. A new kind of lender emerged, requesting fees in return for their service by drawing up regular contracts. A farmer who borrowed money due to poor harvests had to repay the debt from the following year's produce. The granaries were overflowing, but it was becoming increasingly difficult for a poor person to access the share set aside for famine years. The initial produce brought from foreign lands was sufficient to cover anti-enemy contributions, but lacked the generosity that would inspire those leaving the city to return, believing that the land belonged to the gods. Nevertheless, the navy was more magnificent than ever. The ramming bows were adorned with wide strips of red metal, and the carvings on the ship's prows were splendid enough to make the heads of children who touched them spin. The crew still continued their drills, but on some afternoons, captains kept their men in ranks longer than necessary. In the meantime, when a prince arrived, he could hear the oars rising and falling in harmony. This certainly produced a pleasant sound, but those keeping the lists in the barracks knew very well which boats were heavy or which crews were depleted. The difference between display and preparation was something they had already grasped. It was possible to sense the traces and scent of this difference. It was a time when trade flourished and spread. Envoys from shores that woke with the dawn and from the windy lands beyond the horizon would appear before the kings with rich gifts in their hands. They would express partnerships, protection treaties, and demands for tribute in soft tones. The kings would listen, and the maps in the war rooms would become increasingly filled with markings. Places where they once only saw harbors or safe waters on the map were now evolving into garrisons and ports of call where negotiations revolved around the presence of an Atlantean ship. Atlantis, a proud city, tended to view such services provided as a sign of friendship. However, those who collected the money understood the essence of the matter much better.
Even when everything seemed to be going well, it was not easy to signal misfortune to a proud community. The fields were still green, the harbors were active, and the walls gleamed in the sun. Festivals were never lacking in the city. The king continued to wear garments made of simple, pure wool,
even when he took the oath of the kingdom. The great column walls were still reddish and hard. They possessed a grandeur that took one's breath away upon approaching them. But there were other small signs that suggested the old patience was running out. Situations such as a judge becoming annoyed, implying that a case brought from the riverside could actually be solved with a coin, or a captain speaking rudely to a sailor for not keeping the rowing tempo correctly, were noticeable. Even a prince neglecting to wear his ring while sitting in the council of priests could be met with uneasy glances. Small things had begun to multiply for Atlantis. The city seemed overly saturated with these small details. The texts written by historians and thinkers later expressed this narrative in a simple style. The power of the divine connection within the royal lineage had diminished, while human weaknesses and desires had strengthened. Atlanteans now prioritized wealth, not honor. They had ceased carrying the laws of their ancestors on their backs. In the eyes of the public, the walls were valued more for the beauty visible on them than for the responsibilities they symbolized. Looking at the island, this change might not be so clearly felt. However, the fatigue felt at the end of a long day left a sense of looseness, similar to the slipping away of duties that were once strictly held. Perhaps the desire to gather praise before the work was finished was rising within. Ambition was subtly shaping in silent rooms, while meetings held away from the crowd started to occur at strange hours, and the decisions made in these meetings began to be presented as truths already established in public opinion.
In the air, new paths were rapidly emerging, but these paths did not align well with the needs of the people. New garrisons were established in areas where the threat was minimal, and taxes were set more strictly and heavily in the provinces. Some island families, in return for having served their fathers for many years, had acquired 2 houses and 3 warehouses. A few country houses had begun to turn into small courtyards with private baths, a private singer, and a table that could gather more guests than a village feast. The earth was also giving a warning, but people did not feel guilty for ignoring these warnings. The island shook slightly, causing the doors to creak and the lamps to burn with a flickering light. These tremors were small and harmless. Children laughed and clapped as the cups moved on the table. Adults remembered that the earth held a power in its depths and viewed these rare stirrings as a sign of solidity. The sea swelled throughout the winter, gradually eroding the dunes beyond the fields. Canal keepers planted more willow trees on the shore and told the rulers that the water would remain more controlled if a few more roots held during the rainy season. The kings nodded, writing this note aside for their future decisions. However, that winter, the dilemma had become a heavy burden on the city's minds. One mind stood at the outpost, recalling the rings, the springs, and the god who brought the laws. Another mind stood in the war room, looking beyond the pillars at the lands that the maps had faded due to the lack of time. Both minds declared themselves loyal. Both spoke of duty.
but both had begun to forget that this duty had the power to split an individual in two. Whatever its origin, there was no trace of that initial comfort anymore.
The city still maintained its splendor. Pride had multiplied. Ancient teachings said that pride itself was not a sin, but that it became one when one forgot what they were proud of. A people could forget much faster than individuals. Memories and knowledge were stored in traditions, ceremonies, and the way certain things were done. But when even these forms changed, the memories vanished with them. If you change your path quietly enough, memories are among the things that disappear along with those paths. Thus, while the streets were still full of light at sunset, the shadows were lengthening. The warnings were clearly visible, but difficult to hear because the markets were too noisy, the wine was delicious, and the singers were busy learning new songs that described the crimson glow forming on the inner wall after the sun had set. There were also men and women who felt the discomfort but could not name it. They were like sailors who scented the air with their intuition even though there was no visible cloud in the sky. Looking up at the bridges and at the point where the water widened in rings, the reflection of the temple gave a stable image. It was possible to pause and imagine that the surface revealed everything important. It rarely happens. The transition from patience to ambition began with the unrolling of a map on the table. The long table in the palace council room was cleaned, and a map extending from the lands where the sun rose to the known seas was placed between the pillars. Harbors were marked with indelible ink, and currents were indicated with fine lines like vine branches. Scribes added short explanations to the edges of the map that a captain could immediately understand. The locations of fresh water sources, the direction of winds known to blow at the end of summer, and dangerous reefs awaiting a careless boat. Kings always kept such maps, but now the markings had begun to shift from the shores to the interior regions of the islands. The names of towns were already readable beyond the coastal areas. Grain stocks and population counts were being discussed.
Even the number of men capable of bearing arms that a village could send if ordered was now being recorded. These details were a silent indication that the island's borders were starting to overflow the range determined by the sea. Council meetings were held more frequently and ran later into the night. The topics carried an atmosphere reminiscent of the rising of a strained water. Provincial governors had begun to bring news of troubles erupting in distant lands. One prince spoke of a harbor that refused to comply with its old obligations and instead sent envoys to another city. An experienced captain recounted raids on the friendly shore by people recognizable by their hairstyle and carrying shields marked with a flat cross. Each of these reports seemed insignificant on its own, but when combined, they showed that the world shaped around Atlantis' wealth was no longer standing still. Those attending the meeting were determined to curb the world's disorder. Orders were disseminated, reflecting the seriousness of the preparation. The shipyards were told to rebuild all ships with sturdy timber before spring ended.
Workers in the harbors were laboring day and night in the shipyards on the outer ring for new hulls to be launched into the sea. Master miners walked through the warehouses with precise scales in their hands, carefully matching the weights of the oars so that the crew would not have to contend with a power imbalance. Rope makers worked relentlessly to prepare new gear. Ship captains checked the bronze nails and spare rudders piled in the warehouses. Meanwhile, in the training fields, soldiers slammed their spears onto the ground, learning how to move as a single wall against a rain of stones with their shields.
The tone of the officers' voices became harsher, and their gazes sharpened in the same manner. The city had always valued training throughout history, but now it seemed to be preparing as if awaiting a great impending test. Diplomacy underwent the same changes. Harbors they once knew as friends, places they resorted to for oil or navigation advice by presenting gifts, were now witnessing demands for protection and tributes to be paid being discussed in the same breath. A treaty made on a festival day would be brought up again and read with a different tone. More importance would be assigned to overlooked lines. A fee determined for shelter could become a turning point that gave that settlement the name of a garrison. When one of the coastal towns was sinking, a fleet crossing the outer barrier would appear on the horizon, and the ships would anchor and wait before the elders could summon the scribe and the seal. The phrases used by the governors would describe the order of the roads heading west. Rumors in the market suggested that some of the island people had learned to hold a purse in one hand and a spear in the other. Money usually followed the spear. Records of the trade in timber, pitch, and grain were kept on the outskirts of the settlements, far from the center. A chain of warehouses had appeared along the main roads. Sailors could easily access fresh water and new equipment at specific points and could know the names of the people holding the keys to these places. In the interior regions, weighing stations were established where couriers could change their horses and move quickly throughout the night. The kings kept a list of the officials at these stations and inspected them regularly after festivals. A kingdom wanting to move quickly had to learn how to make the transition to long-term action with small steps.
Spies learned how to sail. These were not agents of dark deeds, but honest traders with a proper manner of speech. They reached Greek ports with quality fabrics and fair prices, collecting information while drinking wine in taverns near the shore. How many young men did the city send as oarsmen each year? How long did it take to equip a trireme when the alarm sounded? Which priest showed favor to the judges, or who was the judge's son who preferred racing over training? They collected such information, observing which canals were crowded with ships in the traffic filling the river mouth in Egypt. They would look for clues as to which flank of soldiers was sent when the royalty was angry. Traders would send their bills of exchange with colleagues who charged a bit more for the risk, thereby claiming they made a more profitable sale. They had the capability to reach areas beyond the sea quickly. In Athens, those who loved to debate had heard talk of a Western power that measured the world with a ruler and a spear. Sicilian fishermen would look at a fleet approaching with half sails and say, based on the cuts on their prows, that these might be Atlantean boats. A pilot
living on the islands off the Peloponnese, would recount how a ship with red metal on its beak chased him on the reef where his father had fished since his days. Of course, some stories were lies, invented just for the pleasure of telling. Some information was correct in pieces, but when put together, they began to form an image, like a cloud gathering on a still water surface where the wind had died down. The palace expressed its ambition in its own land with a duty-oriented language, while the kings spoke of keeping the sea lanes safe, ending piracy, and transporting wheat from the rivers to the hungry lands on the shores. The priests who had learned the virtue of patience would silently nod their approval when these words were heard.
Meanwhile, the maps on the throne told the same story in a completely different tone. Lines stretched across the map connecting harbors to garrisons, garrisons to warehouses, and these warehouses to the settlements of island families who enforced their own laws and worship, and who sent support when needed. This is how a state transforms into an empire, without making a noise, without making itself noticed. It just glides silently among the shadows, like a caravan asking for shelter at twilight. When morning comes, it is the new owner of the stables, the courtyards, and the roads. Discussions lasted through the night. Some council members advocated for caution. They spoke of the heavy burden of controlling too many shores and how a purely duty-oriented oarsman would tire. Some reminded the kings that the old laws were made to preserve the cities as a whole, not to make them grow. On the other hand, some members spoke of glorious days to come when they would live under a single law and a single peace. To some, God had placed their resources not to be limited to feeding only a small island. The council that left the room at dawn rarely remembered the objections of the handful of cautious dissenters. Rather, the hopeful speeches lingered in their minds. A new order and movement had begun. The army was changing its footwear, and the men in the public square were being directed to the training ground. They were instructed to walk until they could touch the distant watchtower. Engineers measured the day's walking distance, carefully recording where water could be supplied or where rest would be suitable. Grains and salted meats were stockpiled in warehouses near the harbor. Teams assigned to carpentry had prepared to erect palisades until the second hour of the night. Stonemasons sent to the hills where old wall ruins were found were strengthening those structures. The city was now learning to live away from the scorching sound of its own fountains, while the ships were also adapting to the new order. Captains were practicing battle maneuvers instead of racing for speed and superiority. Signal flags were so well designed that even novice crew members could move with the command they received. Admiral T was experimenting with heavier rams and archer towers that could eliminate the enemy at close range. The palace, being quite pleased with this appearance, did not hesitate to adorn the new equipment with red metals.
Some elderly sailors quietly expressed the opinion that a ship should be simpler and less ostentatious. The new ships were quite fast and powerful, and their appearance was magnificent enough to please the kings. However, the first cracks had begun to appear in distant lands. A town that had long paid only a small fee for temporary shelter was now informed that this fee would become permanent and official. A governor placed someone who served as a judge on an island in a hall where a local elder had stayed for a long Saturday. The elder withdrew and returned to his home, but the home seemed to have shrunk compared to the previous day. Elsewhere, in a river city, the garrison demanded the right to store grain in the public granary and conduct drills in the common areas. However, the expected emergency never came, and the stored grains were not returned. Each of these changes was presented as insignificant but necessary. A traveler who only briefly visited a certain place would not notice these transformations. The world was vast, but the essential thing was the pattern of the whole. Even as the empire was taking shape, the island could claim that it was acting with moderation. A prince could point to an Atlantean ship in view to show that the harbors were now safer. A merchant could count the money he saved thanks to the garrison repelling a group of sea raiders. A priest could suggest that rights were now better protected and that order had finally reached the shores where vendetta reigned. There was truth in these claims. There are traces of reality in the explanations we generally use to defend ourselves. The Greeks once listened to debates in the porticos and fish markets. They had learned to balance pride with caution and lived between their own rivalries and the memories of past ages. Some were inclined to be content with a power that promised calm seas and reliable trade.
Others would spit on the ground and say that a stagnant sea was actually a dead sea. They would state that the peoples who allowed others to write their laws deserved the sluggishness that followed. In the temples of Athena, men prayed for wisdom and strength, and children in the wrestling squares looked towards the western horizon, thinking that their muscles and breath would give them clues about the future. But it must not be forgotten that a rumor needs to find an enemy to grow into a real power. Atlantis was spoken of as having a certain face and a powerful fleet. Rumors had spread, and the island was not afraid to make its intentions clear. It had no chance of hiding them anyway. The sounds of ships and soldiers reached everywhere. The pitch-filled drums echoing on the planks were a part of this movement. Even the newly built walls displayed their freshly cut stones to any stranger who approached them. Atlantis believed that it could show that the magnitude of the power it possessed was natural and justified. The city had lived in balance and moderation for many years. But now, that same understanding of moderation claimed that they were still at the correct scale for this realm, which had already moved beyond a limited world. When all your plans fit into place in time, it was easy to confuse appetite with destiny. The old wise teachers would describe the situation as the calm before the storm. The city streets were still bright. The columns continued to shine in the lamplight. The spring season created a feeling that was both warm and cool. In the distance, the lines on the council tablets beyond the rings extended far enough
that the kings had to consider them before raising their flags and declaring war. The final move seemed poised to be made with a sure hand and a firm step. But the sea would remind them that it exists for moments when a firm hand is not enough. The moment the war began resembled the change in the air that old fishermen felt in their bones. A moving storm was approaching without them realizing it. The trade routes that bore the marks of the city council's war plans gained a completely different meaning.
The routes once drawn for trade now carried the weight of orders. Admirals revealed their preparations with the reports they kept in good days. How many crew members could row for hours without losing their tempo? How many ships were ready for action without repair? How many spare materials were stockpiled on the shelves? Ship captains cast lists, quickly reviewing the stocks of salt, meat, grain, and pitch. The rope maker, who walked confidently, stretching the ropes, indicated the number of new rigs he could deliver. But the figures were silent during this process. No one was singing. Everyone spoke plainly and clearly to express that the island was ready for war. 10 calls had been sent, and princes from every region directed their armies through the canal to the city centered on the ring. Barracks and warships were ready to be filled with soldiers and equipment. The harbor, which normally won people's hearts with its tranquility, had turned into a gigantic mechanism. Triremes lined up, gliding in the light with their refurbished rams. Transport barges were loaded with huge barrels of water and sacks of flour. Sailors checked their armor, tightening the straps of their helmets. They were on alert, as if fearing the ironic twist of fate that August would bring. Slingers lined up smooth stones in their leather pouches, each passing their fingers over them, seeking peace. Archers carefully checked the tension of their bows and warmed their fingers in small braziers before waiting for dawn. The orders given echoed in the voice of the soldiers who had been training for this day for years. The first wave would advance south and east along the known paths across the Western Sea, leaving the north behind. The second group set out to advance toward the fertile riverside areas to display its flag and establish dominance over the shores. The third force would wait west of the pillars to deter envious glances from the interior until the main tasks were completed. The plan resembled a tide chart that changed every second hour. The wind was expected to blow from the north before noon. If the waves became rough after twilight, shelter would be sought on the leeward side of Long Island.
Sleep during the watches and keep your oars dry unless instructed to speed up. The island had hosted the largest fleet to leave the outer canal that year. Their organized operation gave comfort to their hearts. The warships served as sheepdogs, while the transport ships sailed at regular intervals, preventing any sudden change in current from causing collisions between the ships. The admirals placed their bravest captains on the outer flank and directed the calmer ones to the center of the fleet. Signal flags were raised and tied to the masts. The water surface barely rippled until the last ship left the mouth and mingled with the clear movement of the open seas. Their first targets were the long shores of the western desert, where the green river cut through the brown earth and poured its richness into the sea. The island had been trading here for generations. The captain counted the barges and guard ships outside, one by one, watching the waters at the river mouth. They could analyze everything from the colors of the current to the movement of drifting pieces of wood. The garrisons on the shore watched the new fleet carefully, keeping their own ledgers and sending mounted couriers to relay the situation to the interior. The Atlantean envoy landed with a plain cloak and a determined expression. He spoke of the order of the sea lanes, a fee to be paid to bring back patrols if necessary, a long-pending treaty, and other documents. The local rulers exchanged views about the ships they saw, trying to cope with the uncertainty, and finally opted for the pragmatic solution people generally choose. An agreement was reached. The island placed its first tokens on the riverside, guaranteeing both tax and anchoring rights in return. At the signing ceremony, this was promoted as friendship. The event was like a weight on a scale. The first wave crossed the shore, advancing toward the island stretching between the Sunrise Sea and the Great Gulf. These islands contained fishing towns and trade colonies that had served both sides for years.
At dawn, a fleet had anchored slightly off the harbor, and the sun cast a crimson glow on the metal plating of the rams. The elders gathered on the shore watched the scene with stern postures and serious expressions. The admiral requested guides and provisions. The elders asked what they would give in return. The answer was always the same: safe waters, a specific section of the market, and a garrison for only one season. The garrison left strong gates behind as it withdrew from the area. While the first wave secured its anchoring points, the second wave now turned its eyes to the Middle Sea. The maps prepared for the island pointed to ancient origins, revealing trade routes stretching along the shores of the large islands and the long peninsula. These waters were now known for their harbors that housed facts rather than legends. These regions, which had gained prestige with wine production, were strengthening their ancient ties. Raiders maintained their existence in coves that no one could discover a second time. The island, along with adventurous sailors and captains who liked to solve problems, sent fast-moving ships. A pirate den in Sicily, traced to a cove in a narrow strait, was eliminated by blocking the entrance and exit with a line of ships. Pirates who tried to escape by swimming at night were met at sea and taken aboard the ships. However, the option presented to them actually left no choice: either serve according to the rules or be executed and hanged in the courtyard with the knives still on your belts. When morning came, the island brought peace to a shore that had been silent for a long time. The presence shown along the coasts of Tyrrhenia was quite remarkable. Towns with round shields and warriors who knew how to use them had backed down this time. The island people landed in an orderly
and disciplined manner. Shield followed shield, spear followed spear. The first clashes showed how fierce the local resistance was. When a fortress on a hill hurled javelins at the camp and killed more than a dozen well-known soldiers, no one could close their eyes for several nights. But the response was cool-headed and planned.
Engineers built a wide ditch and a strong wall in a single day. Slingers positioned behind these ditches reformed the stones sent by the enemy and returned them. Warriors descending from the mountain soon realized that discipline awaited them. Commanders walked among the troops at these moments, touching the soldiers' shoulders as a sign of the determination they showed while maintaining their order. These contacts became the most valuable reward for morale in the operation, even more important than money. Rumors had begun to spread in eastern parts. The islands off the Peloponnese are known for their good observation. According to the news from there, unusual activity was felt in the west, and an order that did not resemble the rhythm of trade was observed. Ships that provided order, flags that repeated the same maneuvers, and crews strengthened by songs challenging the waves were already on duty. Merchants who had been drinking wine and talking politics for years lowered their voices when they heard the name Atlantis. Some hoped for lower customs fees and calm sea lanes. Others planned their expenditures for spearheads or oils for the gymnasiums. A city feels it when it is asked to realize who it is. The island councils were aware of this interest and aimed to use it to their advantage. Messengers reached the Greek shores before the second wave, bringing with them carefully prepared discourses for the temple steps and council stones. They called for a common cause against sea raiders and spoke of the need to settle accounts with the small tyrants who traded justice. They invited the leaders of the city to participate in an agreement that would put an end to these internal conflicts. This invitation resembled a command imposed with an elegant expression. Those who landed in their harbors for the welcome saw that a garrison was beginning to build a fortress rising above them.
Those who asked for time identified an anchoring place just beyond the headland, where a fleet could stay as long as it wished. Meanwhile, Egypt was watching all this with caution. The scribes managed from the river temples could calculate better than most people could grasp. While recording the regular passage of grain ships, they paid attention to the ships that had a red metal badge affixed to their hulls like a brooch. They noticed that the tax rates of every port that complied with the new regulations increased, even if only slightly. They also got the impression that a foreign patrol roamed freely, as if it were in its own home. Scribes who had been keeping records for 30 generations did not panic. Instead, they sharpened their pens and refreshed their memories. With the meticulousness with which they had previously given detailed names to epidemics and great disasters, they were now preparing reports for the courts. At that time, a new, disciplined, organized, and mercenary power was circulating in the western seas. It maintained both a friendly demeanor and kept its accounting ledger in order. The first serious conflict erupted when a Greek harbor refused to hand over its winter customs building. The island's governor arrived here with a garrison and brought a contract with him. However, the local chief justice greeted him with a grand ceremony and then tightly closed the doors. In response, the admiral pulled his ships toward the shore, ensuring that their decks were visible from the entire town. The chief priest sent the children to collect stones and ordered the women to carry water to the walls. This dispute, which seemed solvable with words, now had its place in an arena with an audience. At that moment, a duel of words began in the harbor. Then, a three-masted ship tried to pass through the narrow strait, but its deck was hit by a jar of pitch covered in fire, and the crew had to throw themselves into the sea, shouting curses. The following island commanders brought more ships and continued their efforts to recapture the strait until dark.
Finally, the island was under siege. The attackers positioned themselves in a circle outside the harbor, waiting for hunger to take its toll. News of the siege spread like wind among the islands. Some islands learned from this, choosing to send envoys to negotiate before resorting to arms. Others panicked, frantically preparing in the hope of finding a handful of men to defend them on a summer morning. In Athens, the debates in the porticos became increasingly sharp. Since its foundation, the city had faced compelling choices and had always been open to courageous debate. Sailors who learned to live by looking at the waves and the wind advocated for caution. Young people recently emerged from border clashes called on the assembly for a memorable and courageous stance. The priests of Athena spoke of the importance of calmness for wisdom and acting without haste for courage. The generals, meanwhile, quietly assessed the lists from the miners and the state of the timber in the warehouses. The city, which prided itself on reason and logic, was now on the verge of a test that was impossible to solve with only these qualities. Despite all this uncertainty, the island fleet had set sail. A fleet crossing the Aegean delivered aid to towns loyal to Athens. Another fleet was heading toward the waters of Athens along the islands. However, the fleets did not anchor immediately in front of the walls, but stayed away, giving their scouts the opportunity to check the security of the coast.
The Athenians, who could assess the situation, sent signals with fire beacons and placed fast messengers between Piraeus and the city. Thus, announcements were delivered in breathtakingly short periods. Towards the end of summer, the theoretical drawings on the council board turned into real boats moving on the sea. Settlements were taking root in the west, dominating the straits and river mouths. In this new order, strategic points were protected by garrisons against possible attacks. A city that reminded its people of the value of freedom by enclosing every untrustworthy piece of land in a circle was now carrying its long debates not to the land, but to the water. And the last word of this debate would now be spoken not by words, but by spears. Athens prepared for this great test with the determination born of habit. The assembly cut off the panic with the rising sun. People who had been talking about road repairs just a week ago
were now facing more serious issues, having found their balance. Envoys from the islands reported seeing red-painted ships on the horizon. A captain who witnessed the blockade in the region recounted that the enemy tightened the chain every night. Priests from the Acropolis reported that the smoke of the divine Theos was rising to the sky, and that an owl had passed over the city at dawn. This was not a sign or promise of victory. It was a clue that the city was awakening. Voting proceeded quickly, and full authority was given to the generals. Leaders who had been operating ships with their own means for years moved. They were tasked with gathering their crews and bringing their ships to the Piraeus harbor.
The poorest of the cities sat at the oars. They had neither armor nor horses, but Athens trusted their hands. A city rooted in internal peace had made its simplest laborer the foundation of its power. Sailors had stored the timber they needed for months. Their inventories almost exactly matched the general's plans. Pitch was heated, deck nails were counted, and the decks were covered with sand to prevent slipping from any blood or water splash. After the drums were checked, spare drum skins were carefully placed on hooks. The first goal was to break the siege, which had become a motto. The harbor, at twilight, was hidden behind the place where foreigners unfamiliar with the region succumbed to the current. But the Athenian captains knew this place well. As daylight faded, they prepared a small fleet and set off, allowing the tide to carry them along the curved route of the outer channel. They advanced in the shadow of the headland until the last moment. Then the helmsman gave the command to row. The oars struck each other in a rigid harmony. The Atlantean ships holding the mouth of the canal moved quickly to try and close the passage. This maneuver was as clever as expected. The Athenians, having anticipated this move, split their lines and directed 1/3 of their boats into the shallow, probing waters where only locals prevailed. The leading trireme passed the barricade, hearing the soft whisper of sand beneath its keel, and advanced at an ideal angle to turn the blockade into a trap. The other ships rowed directly toward the guards, opening a passage with their rams. Sailors distracted their rivals by throwing grapes and wooden nails. Experienced fishermen hiding at the gates moved to cut the chains of the enemy ships with the knives they had used since their fathers' time.
In the first light of the morning, the market people learned that the strait had reopened and that the grain cups in the customs house were back under Athenian control. Although this victory was small on the map, it resonated greatly in the minds of the people. Throughout that week, free cities sent envoys to Athens. Some requested garrisons for support. Some offered ship assistance. And some only made promises. The city accepted every kind of aid, but sent back two more important things. A timetable hung upon them and a clear commitment given. Predictable aid carried courage to points that grand speeches could not reach. Along with this, the island signaled that this situation would not easily close. The subsequent second wave arrived very decisively, and this operation was like a harbinger of the end of the old world. The most suitable area for establishing a camp on the mainland was chosen as the flat ground where a creek's pebbly bed flowed into the sea. east of the city. Behind the area was a gentle slope with stubble fields and an empty temple. This terrain, which was both orderly and strategic, as well as suitable for battle, became an arena where two different battle tactics clashed. The Atlanteans landed with ostentatious discipline. Ramps were set up for armed whalers, and the sailors, in their bright armor, disembarked in the light of Sunday morning. Slingers positioned beyond javelin throwing distance began hurling their stones with a steady noise. Engineers were busy with their stakes and mines. A solid line of entrenchment had been established by noon. Officers silently directed their men. Actions worked more effectively than words.
This discipline had been rehearsed countless times in the training grounds beneath their crimson walls, and now it was being applied with the same precision at the tip of their noses, smelling of salt and pitch. Athens met them fiercely and prepared. The phalanxes lined up and waited patiently on the ground. They had established an order in their center where their steps would be firm. War was inevitable between the two sides, and the consequences would be heavy for both worlds. The right flank was over the deep, so one wing could not turn easily without wetting its shield and breaking the file. The left flank was positioned a short distance further back to withstand the first blow. The soldiers in the front ranks were experienced men who had felt the weight of enemy shields countless times before. Behind them lined up farmers, potters, and blacksmiths who had worked until they learned the pattern in the dust of the academy. The cavalry waited as a threat and control element ahead of the flank. They had established a flat and simple order, but this order was quite difficult to break when it consisted of people accustomed to standing shoulder to shoulder. The first clash began between slings and bows. The Atlantean stones flew long and straight with dazzling accuracy. The Athenian archers, on the other hand, opened a rapid barrage, targeting the officers and standard bearers. A signal came, and the lines began to move. The Atlanteans tried to wedge themselves into the Athenian center, using their weight. In response, the hoplites answered with a slow but determined maneuver. Shields overlapped.
Spears found their targets from above, below, and even from the brief openings of the helmet rings, momentarily opened for breathing. The sound created by the conflict resembled the noise produced by a tight door being forced open. The creek quickly turned crimson where the men's feet entered the water. The clash was bending, but not breaking. The islanders pressed twice into the center to push back the Athenian ranks by the length of a spear. However, the senior soldiers in the front ranks retreated twice against this pressure and then readjusted their lines. On the left side, the rejected wing was punished with a rain of stones that wounded instead of killing. On the right flank, the cavalry moved only when the ground firmed up and the weight of the clash was felt. With a short charge, they neutralized a few enemy slingers, forcing the rest to flee behind their own lines. As the day progressed, even small gains became valuable. The roles changed when the islanders attempted to advance toward the shore. New soldiers disembarked from the ships to add weight to the assault. However, the rising tide and wet stones exposed their every step. When the Athenians noticed this stumble, they responded with a measured pressure rather than a frantic attack. The center line advanced 3 paces in unison, like a single body. Spear points found their targets, and shields bowed sharply. The lines that the Marines hoped to strike hard and disperse met them like a sheer wall. The officers on the island side raised their standards to signal a retreat. The standards waved, and order tried to reform. Meanwhile, a runner on the Athenian right flank managed to leap across the creek and reach the front lines, announcing that the enemy's left flank was retreating. Whether this news was true or false, when it reached the ears of the exhausted soldiers, it gave them the courage to fight again. The clash now turned from a push and shove into a propelling force. The Atlanteans withdrew one step, then another. They had become aimless, losing their resolve.
The soldiers who retreated to their shelter left the ground to those who held it. The battlefield, littered with spent arrows and broken spear tips, fell into darkness. Both sides counted their losses. The Athenians erected a trophy monument, more of a message than a sign of victory, by joining the trunks of 2 young trees and hanging enemy shields upon it. This battle was not considered a victory. It was only a response given. The island forces returned to their ships, accompanied by the non-retreating guards. The officers knew that the place for the war was the sea. The sea was the domain of both the island and Athens. Days later, when the fleets met at the entrance of a narrow strait, the Atlanteans moved in a wide formation, attempting to envelop both flanks. The Athenians, however, sought advantage in narrow and dangerous waters. They chose a battleground where skill found an immediate response. Orders and signals spread quickly from mast to mast. The Athenian captains waited patiently, making moves in succession when the moment was right. With maneuvers called diaklus, they created gaps in the enemy lines and expertly drove their ships with sharp beaks through the seemingly impenetrable formations. Although the islanders turned their rudders and countered with harsh moves, the Athenians quickly turned back, attacking their exposed sides. The clash lasted throughout the morning, with thick smoke hanging over the plain. The sea echoed with the smell of pitch, resin, and the sweat of struggling bodies. The men in the ranks continued to pull the reins with bloody hands. Drums kept a rhythm with a fury that brought order to the chaotic fight. By noon, the sea had become a graveyard full of broken masts. The islanders had lost valuable rams and experienced crews that could not be replaced in months. The Athenians also suffered heavy losses, but learned a vital lesson. Captains who kept their composure could deal with the enemy without diving into dangerous waters.
As the wind picked up in the afternoon, the Athenians returned to their anchoring area, forming a barrier with their ships. Bows pointed outward, ropes tightly fastened. The islanders decided not to force this order. They gathered their wounded and headed for the open sea. However, this victory did not bring an end to the war. It brought an end to an illusion. The Greeks now realized that a great power from the west could be checked by a city-state that knew resistance was possible and chose to stand firm in the straits. Towns that witnessed the victory began sending grain and soldiers to Athens without hesitation. The Spartans, who disliked their traditions, assigned their toughest soldiers to hold strategic passes that would complicate the landing operations of the invasion forces. The islanders, meanwhile, kept a close watch, preparing light boats to carry news and sending signals from the next headland. The network of small loyalties, which often frayed, was now strongly bonded as the island provided them with a common purpose. Athens paid for every lesson with blood. Funeral processions moved in long lines up the roads of Kerameikos. Names were carved into stones. Mothers stood upright with dignity. The city never claimed that the loss was a small price. It knew what it had to do if it wanted to survive. They turned the pain into stubborn resolve and repaired and relaunched their boats. While new crews were trained, envoys were sent to the rescued harbor, promising to return if necessary. The time of the next captain was announced to their allies, and that promise was kept. Council members on the island who once spoke of fate were now discussing precautionary measures and the management of time.
The columns of the red-walled temple at home still gleamed, but what was written upon them now served as a warning rather than a praise. The power that expected celebration found itself in a struggle. A realm accustomed to planned movement had encountered an enemy that could read time and water and use both to its advantage. Thus, the conflict between the cities became a long-lasting tension. The West was measuring its losses while protecting the security of its inner circle. The East was maintaining its resistance and counting the days until the next call. Between them stretched the sea. The sea punished those who dared to defy it like a sage who never forgets, yet rewarded the patient. Approaching rewards and punishments were already appearing on the horizon. Warnings that had not yet been spoken aloud were slowly accumulating. The hot spring in the region grew warmer for a week, then returned to its old state. The cold water tasted neither of stone nor metal, carrying a strange flavor the town could not distinguish. Fishermen brought home fish covered in strange sores, surprised that they found them in waters they were sure were always clean. The dolphins that loved to play in the ringed waters had vanished without a trace. Carpenters in the ship holds claimed that the planks were still weeping despite new patches. Priests did not speak much in public, but privately, in windless nights, they talked of lamps burning down and a strange hum echoing beneath the temple floor stones. like the noise of a carriage from afar. The first tremor came at noon and felt like a joke. Glasses began to dance as door frames creaked. Children burst into laughter, noticing that the water in the bowls trembled as if touched by someone. After the tremor, the ground calmed down again, and people returned to their work. But the second tremor came at dawn. This time, it was like a heavy beast that spread across the entire island. The hearts of men who sprang from their sleep and sat in the darkness pounded fast enough to vibrate their chests. The unrest that spread in the morning grew with the howling of dogs in the harbor.
A pile of masts collapsed, hitting the quay. Guards claimed that they saw the water strike the planks and then recede, even though there was no wind. Old men who had spent their entire lives working in the fields placed their hands on the soil as if greeting an old friend they hadn't seen in a long time. But this soil was no longer the soil they knew, and that night the exodus began. Short tremors causing the shutters to rattle and long, restless breaths rising from the rafters echoed. A deep, low sound seemed to rise from the ground, with timbers resembling a single silent note. As the earth spoke a language no one understood, the kings acted. Messengers were sent to lock the bridges in the interior and lower the harbor chains. Engineers were ordered, if a wave came, the public should drain the water to safe areas so the walls would not be damaged. The priests in the region burned oil on the altar, keeping the flames high. In that light, the red metal column was dazzling, with a splendor similar to other seasons. It gleamed like a promise on one hand, and was sensed like a warning that had been waiting to be heard for a long time on the other, silently declaring its presence. When night fell, the third tremor was as hard and chilling as a giant hammer blow. The tremor hurled people from their places as tiles were flung from the roofs to the street. The bronze plates in the outer ring clashed, making a noise similar to the ringing of shields in a chest. One of the keystone blocks split, and one of the huge stone layers collapsed to the depth of a man's hand, opening a deep void. Through that crack, fine sand spurted out, indicating that the island was leaking like a jar. The sides of the canals collapsed, revealing the soft soil of their origin as the barges leaned and rested against the piles they were tied to. The sound rising from the hot spring rumbled as if water was boiling in the cauldron above it. The cold spring, which had a clear surface, became cloudy and spat out air accompanied by angry little explosions. But the real fear came from the sea. Instead of a single harmonious giant wave, a series of devastating waves, each stronger than the last, began to pound the shore.
The water in the ringed pools quickly vanished with the pull of a giant hand, leaving behind a bare layer of mud filled with struggling fish. Before anyone could understand what was happening, the water returned, climbing up to the inner walls as if nothing had happened, then receded again, and surged once more, rising even higher. Boats tightly tied to the moorings snapped their ropes and began to drift, spinning on the surface of the pools.
A large three-masted ship in the outer harbor broke its chains and slammed sideways into a bridge pier that was believed to have stood since the deep past of the Atlantic. The pier, which looked like the last memorable resilience of the era, finally cracked with the expected noise, and the incoming wave shattered it like straw. At the same time, fires began to rise. They were on alert as if they had been waiting for their moment. Overturned stoves in the kitchen and falling lamps fueled the disaster. In the palace district, a roof beam collapsed, filling the courtyard with sparks. The fierce wind carried the flames through the narrow streets to the bridges, further increasing the chaos. People formed lines, passing buckets from hand to hand, the wet ropes cutting their palms. But in other neighborhoods, the real enemy for the people was not the fire, but the earth which struck blows as if it had come alive. The compacted soil in the courtyards lost its strength, turning into a pile of mud that swallowed the step up to the ankle and then to the knee. Walls that looked solid in daylight bent like a shell. A corner of a granary slipped from its foundation, collapsing with a surprising slowness and grace that astonished the onlookers. The fire of the temple did not go out. The priests passed the flame from one sacred lamp to another as the statue's eyes were turned away, towering above them. The smoke hung suspended in the still air twice. But twice, a strong wind from the basement bent the torches as if a storm had come to sweep through the hall. People filled the court of oaths. They were too curious to flee.
The kings, neither in robes nor crowns, stood on the stone barefoot and with bowed heads. Old stories said that God listened more to those who showed their mortal feet. They placed their hands on the red column, speaking loudly, asking for time and mercy. But the column returned their words only with a dull echo. A response came from very deep down, but it was neither the voice of a god nor a man. That moment before dawn, which resembled the last breath, split the island in two. The land outside the city sank slightly, as if it had taken one breath and then forgotten how to exhale. Waters overflowing the canals spread beyond where they should have been, becoming directionless. A long crack appeared on the ship sheds. It flowed over a carved door, stopping at the hinge like a skillfully engraved line. In the inner ring, fissures opened in places along the street. These fissures turned the pavement strip into ridges the height of a man. People dragged the wounded over these difficulties and then witnessed the pavement collapse again, as if it were an exhausted living thing. Afterward, the advancing wave easily crossed the outer wall. The bronze metal plates darkened under the green water, bent, and finally collapsed. The force of the wave tore the rafters from the walls and slammed a fishing boat so violently into a facade that the severed hull was embedded in the window. People fled to the central hill, guided by their habits. The rings they thought offered security had now become threatening. Bridges that had not been damaged before broke and fell into the turbulent currents, and those that could withstand were not very gentle. Openings reserved for heavy carts or oxen turned into hellish traps. People piled many corpses into them. At the summit of the hill,
the kings tried to maintain the remaining order. Runners were sent to clear the path to the high fields and to deliver water skins and blankets to the square in front of the temple. But some did not complete this journey. They did not return.
The columns stood upright, remaining still as if listening to a melody from the depths of the earth. But then they slightly inclined. A corner of the roof collapsed, and the sunlight illuminated a spot it had never touched before. The god statue inside the temple watched the entire fall, motionless. The priests could not even move from their places due to the intensity of the swell that rose beneath their floor, forming a dark fissure between the columns and the altar. Then the column began to tremble. A metal plate slid off with a high-pitched scream. Then another fell. The old men who had oiled the plates for many years reached out to save them as if they were living beings. But the second wave took them and flung them against the opposite wall. When the waters receded again, the column was still stubbornly standing. However, a massive block that fell to the ground shattered, echoing like a heartbeat. Following this, the column slipped and mingled with the darkness, with a sound resembling the echo of a bell buried in the sand. The central hill had now become a small island on its own. People wandered among their dwindling community, staring blankly around. Some began to repeat the names of their children who had silently disappeared. Some were immersed in silent prayers. Others looked at the blood-red plates scattered around like leaves torn from the inner walls. A group of soldiers had formed a cordon, still maintaining their gaze fixed on the desolate ground. They carefully guided people past them and did not lift their heads even when a tremor, which expanded the light cloud of dust upon them with a new burst from cracking stones, occurred. In the interior, the order that continued from generation to generation broke down spontaneously within an hour. The field terraces were destroyed. The canals overflowed, finding new beds that forgot their boundaries. Where the soil lost its resilience, the water reservoirs that once looked like thin lines cracked and shattered in waves. Far away, the hills that had always been blue, as they aged, suddenly sharpened, gaining a youthful and angry appearance. Large rocks were flung around, mowing down the surrounding groves like the long tracks left by a farmer harvesting his grain. The sea never stopped. Following that colossal wave, smaller waves that found new paths came and went. There were panicked dashes in the streets. People were pulled from door frames and flung onto piles of debris timber. The last wave of the morning was like a long and final strike coming from the foaming. It tore and lifted everything on the water's surface. Both man-made debris and nature's remnants were tossed about as if they had no weight. When it receded, it left behind boats dragged onto balconies and a shipwreck spanning between ruined houses like a hasty bridge thrown by a giant's hand. Then silence reigned, but not of peace. This was the overwhelming silence of a city that had lost its voice. Thin smokes rose from the darkened ruins. The smoke from damp fires neither heated nor extinguished. The sharpness of the salt, the bitterness of the ashes, the sour smell of crushed grain and marsh mud mingled in the air. Neither birds remained nor any sign of movement. Even the dogs crouched and trembled where they were, or lay on the ground, never to rise. The sun rose and exposed everything visible with cold justice. It spared no one. By noon, only a few tall structures and the central hill were still above the water. The rest was a complex landscape of quartz particles submerged in water, broken stones, and irregular canals slowly turning back into the sea. The outer layers of the city were buried under a brown, slow-moving, muddy shroud. The mouth of the harbor had been reshaped. Old routes were lost, and new passages emerged where the places it relied on for navigation faltered. The old ship sheds were now broken and abandoned wooden boxes. The bridges were torn from their places, resembling the crooked teeth of a broken jaw.
The red metals that once shone on the walls now lay on the ground in torn plates and bent strips, adding sharp metallic lines to this wreckage. The survivors finally moved. Grief had slowed them, but not stopped them. They gathered the wounded and carried them onto the highest stones, using stretchers made of masts and door planks. They counted the number of children aloud. The sailors were transporting the boats they still had to different shores, disembarking people with loads that seemed quite small for the task. The engineers were identifying areas on the ground that still bore weight and covered an area the size of a foot, marking them with charcoal. The square in front of the temple was defended with the calm born in the last handful of guards and people who had nothing left to lose. The kings did not say that Atlantis would be saved. Instead, they acted with the realization that the Atlanteans needed to be saved. As the day progressed, the tremors ceased, giving way to a strange unease. The sea was still surging, but this time it held no apparent threat. A silence reigned that was not born of respect. This silence was abruptly cut short, like a scream that rises and then disappears. People looked toward the horizon, but did not know what they would see there. No help they waited for would come from that direction. All they had was limited to the work they could do before the night swallowed the last warmth of everything. And so, the self-sufficient island became a painful lesson for others. The island had lived circularly and was now dying circularly. It had concentric rings made of water and stone, but now they were turning into concentric rings made of mud and debris. These shores, once home to ships, would now become mooring sticks carrying the curse of generations violently run aground. At dawn, the city had left behind only its bare bones.
The storms on the earth had now given way to a slight tremor that vibrated the dust, filtering and flying from the broken walls. Smoke rose from damp fires that could not catch a light. The sea was not cresting, but rising as a swell, that slowly pushed the debris toward every surviving eye. The kings stood in the square, choosing the tasks to be done. They sent people with water skins and blankets to the highest stone hills. The youth were assigned to mark the safe paths with chalk. The elders were sent to places where they could count and guide people with their calming voices. The order was clear: rescue the survivors. Do not engage in conflict with the sea. Do not chase treasures. Every helping hand was used on stretchers. All means that could be used as boats were turned into ferries, and they began carrying passengers to the trusted peaks. The island began to feel the pain of loss. In the very first hours, the cool spring waters turned brown. The warm springs silently stopped flowing. The water systems that had protected the island during drought years cracked and became contaminated. When the women touched the water to their lips and tasted it, they only shook their heads in denial. Farmers crossed the boundaries of the plain and saw their fields turned to mud. They witnessed the terraces collapse and flatten, while the orchards were torn apart by irregular lines. They found animals caught in the ropes stretched among the reeds, their legs injured where they became entangled. They cut the throats of those wounded animals, for that was the only merciful act that could be done at that moment. The scribes placed a plank over 2 broken drums and began writing the names from the rings. The list was orderly at first, but it quickly devolved into a jumble of nicknames and notes about families remembered incompletely. One woman gave 3 names and then fell silent, her head in her hands.
A child asked a soldier to tie a strip of cloth to his arm, thus wanting to show that he would be counted as a carrier, not just another loss. Meanwhile, a priest arranged small statues brought from household shrines on the steps of the main temple. It was as if he wanted to offer people a face to help them gather their courage. The engineers, on the other hand, tested the broken bridges by walking on them with poles to check their stability. They moved with the heightened attention of people made sensitive to the unexpected. They drew a simple map on a wall with ashes, 2 paths, one leading down and the other extending to the single stairwell leading to the pier. They identified a narrow strip where a single boat could pass without damaging its ribs, and the crew began working with hoisting gear to clear that area. Stones were pulled aside, and piles of wood were sent to the saw. Work progressed quickly, because there were people who could maintain order even when few commands were given and many were working. Boats came and went. Miners continued without stopping until they lost their fingers. Along the new waterfront, a line of small boats slowly appeared. Fishermen brought dinghies, while guides delivered light skiffs with sharp bows. The last functional trireme was dragged in from a new bend that had existed only a day ago and was aligned to rest on the stones lining the marketplace. The crew connected the stern of the ship to an overturned couch and laid planks panning from the deck to the shore. This allowed the wounded to be easily carried without falling into the chaotic cold below.
Mothers handed their children over to strangers, watching them disappear into the crowd. Words of a messenger who returned from the scattered rings with a sharp wound were heard. A group of homes continued to exist in a great void, like an island, and there were about a dozen people waving cloth from their roofs. One of the teams took ropes and went to rescue these people, returning with 9. By noon, the peak had become the campsite.
In the places that were once courtyards, holes and spread mats formed narrow paths. Fires were fueled by the surging waves of the sea, and items like broken floorboards. A boy who had spent his life herding goats, displaying his resolve, had become a cook. He made a watery soup with grains scraped from the bottom of a broken jar. But there was no salt, and no one complained about this lack. A doctor who had learned to treat those who fell from the steep slopes of the quarries continued to work almost without breathing. As the minutes passed, the doctor used the wine on his knives until it was consumed. Then he switched to warm water. He told a tired soldier to hold a child's arm tightly, as if it were the last remaining plank of the ship. The soldier did so without hesitation. However, the island was not staying still. The earth constantly trembled with tiny shivers, causing people to stumble unnoticed. Although the sky was clear, a deep sound resembling irregular thunder was heard from afar. At that moment, the sea began to recede, making the harbor look as if it were breathing in and out. When it rose and came back, it passed mercilessly over the broken streets. The sheer mountain ridge to the west looked enormous, like a patient ox, but at the same time it diminished and lowered, leaving behind new scars of angry, raw rock. By noon, the sea receded even more than before. This time, the bones of the submerged rings beneath the waves became visible, like the ribs of a collapsed chest. The stone mouths of the culverts opened up, drying out for the first time since they were built. Fish thrashed and quickly died in the hands of those trying to save them from the dried out pools and send them back to the sea. People rushed in the mud to save what they could. When they returned, they had a table, a cradle, and a chest surrounded by iron bands that had managed to stay intact. But they were still in the mud when the great wave of the day struck. The wave dragged them up the slope, tossing them about, covered in mud.
When the chest was opened,
The only thing inside was an old book whose sodden pages stuck together, making them look like dry leaves. When the kings looked at the island's landscape, they realized that this land could not last another night. The earth had broken its agreement. The canals had turned into coves, and the streets into narrow waterways that recalled the sea with every new gust of wind or tide. Messengers were swiftly sent to distant islands and small ports along the coast. They were ordered to bring food and essential supplies from every boat, leaving all old ties behind. The surviving guards were instructed to do everything in their power to get people onto the boats. This effort would continue until no one was able to move from their place. Like every city that loves itself, this city had to learn to love its people more in its hardest times. Every small action taken in silence carried great meaning for those who remained. Finally, the last priest, on the verge of exhaustion, climbed the broken steps to the point where the old columns still stood. There he took a little oil from a cracked jar in his hand and poured it down the edge of the abyss that was plunging into darkness along with the floor. He thought of the names that had shaped the island, the names of a hill and a water source. He had no expectations. Sometimes there are moments that go beyond asking. Those moments of silence when believers act as they know how, when they have no other recourse. As the final descent began, the sun had lowered, and a sudden slope began to rise on the horizon where the sea should have been flat. Yet there was no sign of foam on the surface. It advanced without a crest. The ground beneath the hill groaned like the string of a colossal instrument. Stones clashed underfoot with a sound like gears. At that moment, the island took a deep breath and then refused to let go this time. The central hill had sagged downward, like a simple sigh of hands.
Afterward, a new crack appeared on the pavement. Children screamed, and chaos spread as the lines moved swiftly and vaguely, cutting across the safe spots learned that morning. The boats were forced to move away when they struggled to reach the shore. The last three-masted boat slid forward, taking a heavy load that stretched from one end of its deck to the other. Oars were submerged, a dinghy capsized, and swimmers were dragged onto the boats by hands that distinguished neither friend nor foreigner. The movement of the sea suddenly took the shape of a face. The ruined outer structures were torn from their places and flung onto nearby debris, as if turning the island into a piece of water surrounded by valleys. The last memories of the inner walls vanished in 3 silent stages. First, the noise of the shackles snapping was heard. Then, the layers of plates peeled away like a shell. Finally, the core folded, collapsed inward, and silently disappeared into the deep hole that swallowed it without the slightest splash or resistance. On the decks far from the waterfall, people witnessed a scene that would live in the memories of grandchildren centuries later. The hill where the temple stood did not collapse, but it lowered its position, sinking as if a giant hand had laid its weight upon it. Even the roofs that the sea had gently left visible in the first light of morning were submerged until they became invisible. The tips of the highest columns were level with the waves.
The red stone pavement that was once the threshold suddenly rose in a square shape and then abruptly receded. It vanished as if it had chosen to disappear of its own will. There was no longer an accessible island. The city's place was only covered with a brown, dried scar. It was covered with waterways that drowned and wandered among alluvium, mud, and broken stone layers. Too murky and chaotic for a ship to navigate through with a steady rudder. Night descended with a dark gloom devoid of stars. Moisture and smoke rising from the sea covered the boats, creating a low-ceilinged sky. People continued to row as they tired and lay down on the benches with their weakened bodies. New ones took their places. Fathers confirmed the number of their children by touch.
Mothers leaned gently toward their ears, whispering their words inwardly, trying to prevent the words from falling into the water and being lost. Even the kings had given up their crowns. They were now just individuals carrying loads or bringing water. The orders they gave were simple, focused on saving the next breath, for when the earth could not stand, the crown held no meaning. With the first light of day, the water unexpectedly filled an area that had not been there before. Its depth was not great, but it undulated slowly, stretching to the horizon like the breathing of a tired world. Around it, wall debris stood irregularly, resembling the teeth of a drowned jaw, but then slid from their places and became invisible. The boats approached the edges of this new formation, looking for a way to pass through, but found no channel. The skiff named Oz, however, made contact with the ground in an area known to have no bottom. Seeing the oars stick in the clinging mud, the captain struggled to pull the boat back. But beyond the brown arch, the sea looked calm and harmless in blue tones. Yet this arch was a trap that would preserve the debris within for a long time, and then drag it piece by piece, showing the memories of the past to the living. As the hours approached noon, the surrounding boats maintained their distance from the shore, heading toward the harbors in the outermost ring. People who made contact with land for the first time surrendered to a feeling of relief, although happiness was not yet reflected on their faces. Those who disembarked from the boats were plunged into a silence more somber than crying. They drank water greedily, using only their hands. Those who stepped onto the shore fell to the ground, burying their faces in the clean earth, and slept. It was as if they longed to be surrendered to the arms of the earth. The local residents acted honestly, offering a helping hand. They cut the bread they could share into thin slices and distributed the dry cloaks they could find.
Then the children and the elderly were counted, but no one dared to ask questions that could relive what had happened. As weeks passed, ships from other regions wanted to approach the island's former location, but were forced to turn back from the same point. Because that passage, which had split the sea like a straight path in the light of the rising sun, was now completely closed off by alluvium, mud, and a broken layer of stone. A helmsman managed to glimpse a blue line in the distance, but it was utterly impossible to reach. A rope thrown into the water sank and surfaced again, coated in mud. The shaman watched the ever-shifting landscape as the ceaseless changes continued to confound the maps. This infuriated the captains, forcing them to establish more observation posts and add menacing warnings to the charts. No one cared to utter the island's old name anymore. They simply called it the shallow waters. The area was now referred to as brown water. In the Western Sea, it became notorious, spoken of as a zone where even skilled pilots refused to work. Amidst this, the survivors slowly struggled to return to normal life. Scribes, dedicated to keeping their knowledge current, performed calculations based on memory, replacing their lost tablets. They quickly prepared wooden boards, inscribing them with names, professions, and notes that all debts were now considered paid, a powerful step toward restarting life. The masons taught island-specific methods to ensure the stones remained above sea level. Engineers demonstrated how to construct ditches and dikes to prevent the fields from being swamped by floods. Blacksmiths started with small items to save time. They forged nails, hooks, pins, and rivets. As the work expanded, they moved on to making locks, hinges, and shackles. The red metal that once adorned the inner walls now drew attention only in brooches or the subtle details of knives. It was the echo of a city that had learned self-care, but had forgotten how to sustain itself. Some individuals carried stories that transcended the history of tools. One pilot, who had witnessed the final descent from his ship's deck, later sat in a tavern on a Greek island, sketching his vision with charcoal on a plank. In his drawings, circles, lines, and a high central hill appeared. He depicted the bridges, the canals, and the grand gate plated with gleaming metal sheets. He pushed the plank away and stated that he had learned what the sea thought of a man's hands trying to defy it. Elsewhere, a priest told a cleric in a riverside city that the sound of a toppled column rang out like a bell. A scribe quietly took note of these words. Scribes had long experience recording the phrases people used to make sense of destruction and grief. A dethroned king had told his daughter that the law was not a concrete stone, but that the people must remember who they were when the ground beneath them slipped away. A child nodded, for children who listened to such words grew into adults who carried on. As time went by, the new shores learned to impose their own rules upon the brown water belts. Captains returned with measurements from the coasts, debating in the marketplaces how fishing lines should be used according to the seasons. Masters warned the young men not to succumb to the temptation of the lost metal pieces. Many a fine boat had been lost to greed. In those days, a temple stood on an untouched headland. The final metal plate that shone at sunset resembled the red fin of a fish. People would leave handfuls of grain there when they had it. They said this was not to feed the gods, but to keep their own memory alive. And so, Atlantis was carried from one place to another, transforming into a tale. Finally,
The world chose its own night and turned. That night, the sea finished its work. The once circular city first became a faint blur on a map, then a warning on a pilot's tongue. The Atlanteans became farmers and sailors on other shores. They carried their customs with them and inscribed their names upon new lands.
They told their children that a clean wall gleamed and that the radiance was merely a sign. They stressed that strength resided in the stone and in the hand that held it faithfully. The story did not perish with the city. It became voices and settled into memories, journeying toward the water in the recollections of sailors who had seen the muddy shores with their own eyes, and families who had learned to live in the shadow of different hills. A pilot drew circles on the tavern table with a wet finger and told the fishermen that somewhere beyond the columns lay a harbor encircled by water rings and stones. A priest, far from home, placed a small statue of a sea god on a new altar and prayed for the column that fell and rang. A young girl sleeping on a boat that night grew old and told her children that order sustained people's lives and that pride had drawn the sea into the city, just as a knife is drawn into its sheath. In time, the facts aged, but the forms endured. Generations later, a Greek lawgiver set out to find traces of ancient wisdom in a country known for meticulous record-keeping. Solon, during his time restructuring Athens, traveled to Egypt, seeking to understand how other societies maintained their balance. The Delta priests had spent years engraving their history onto temple walls, while the Greek communities were still arguing about how to measure fields. The Egyptians had already learned to write. In the city of Sai, an old priest welcomed Solon at the temple of the goddess the Greeks believed to be Athena. The visitor spoke of floods, fires, and how fate had turned a library into a pile of ashes. The priest smiled at this sincerity, then imparted a lesson to the Greek. Greeks, the priest said, you are still children. You recall the latest catastrophe, but carry no knowledge of any previous ones. Your cities lose their documents to flames and waters, which is why you can never access a common past. The priest in Sai shared a story taken from the most ancient lists kept in their halls. Long before the dates the Greeks could even name, there was a great island beyond the straits marking the end of the inner sea. It rested in the west of the ocean, where the sun sets. The island was wealthy and mighty. It had 10 kings, all brothers from an ancient lineage. Its fields were immensely fertile. From its mines, a red metal that retained its color despite the sea air was extracted. The city featured a protected harbor and a temple dedicated to the sea god, where bulls were sacrificed as offerings. In that era, the island dispatched its navies westward and began exploring the shores of the Middle Sea. It first took cities under its protection, then under its domination. It reached out to the mouths of rivers. Finally, it set its sights on the coasts of Greece. The priest shared the narrative of the past with Solon, relating that in those distant years, the city of Athena had opposed this powerful Western rival. Though not yet defined in the detailed form Solon knew,
it shared the same character. It embraced order and measure and was unyielding. A solitary figure among the Greeks, it met the invaders both in open fields and in the harbor, astonishing them and reclaiming the captured cities. It cast down the pride that had grown too great in the east. Then the land rose, and the sea advanced again. The western island and the plain surrounding it disappeared into the depths of history in a single day and night of misfortune. Where there had been a passage yielding to ships, a layer of mud formed, obstructing progress in the deep loving waters. Solon took notes upon hearing this story, outlining a poem. He asked for the names and figures that would be part of this work. The priest spoke to him of a past spanning thousands of years, so ancient it would astound the modern mind.
9,000 years ago, the priest began to Solon, and proceeded to narrate the events of that time. Solon, determined to write a poem based on what he heard, sketched the figure-filled story on a wax tablet and continued listening for details. He gathered information about the rings, bridges, and canals the city was built upon, also adding notes on the walls made of gleaming metal. The story also mentioned the 10 kings who gathered for a sacred bull hunt and swore an oath in the temple. Those kings had carved their laws on the red column, but this era, which began with peace and discipline, had gradually evolved from splendor into greed. This story bore the traces of ancient testimony and was instructive. Solon carried this story to his homeland, sharing it with his relatives, but the poem he designed was never completed. His life included defending laws, battling enemies, and an old age met with an untarnished name. Though the story was an unfinished poem, it was not forgotten. It was passed from Solon to Dropides, from there to old Critias, and finally found its place in the memory of the young Critias, who sat next to Socrates. These narratives were the rings stretching from the past to the present of those who created the story from what they knew of the order. In the time of Plato, while Athens was grappling with conflicts both internally and with other cities, this story was rediscovered by a young mind devoted to clear thought. Plato had a habit, turning stories into a mirror, allowing a city to look at itself in their reflection. Plato transformed this lesson from ancient Egypt into 2 dialogues. He named his first conversation Timaeus, after an Italian philosopher who spoke of the creation of the world and the nature of the soul. He named the second dialogue Critias, in honor of the person who gave substance to this family story. Thus, a suitable foundation was laid to transmit the narrative.
Socrates requested an exemplary story that would demonstrate the virtues of an ordered state. Upon this, the guests presented a story inspired by the ancient past. The disciplined and brave city of Athena was facing a great power that was increasingly collapsing. The transmitted information sometimes emerged from memories like a reflection of the past, and sometimes seemed to be newly constructed. Outside the city was a flat, square plain divided by canals. This area was about 100 stadia wide. Rings of land and water were connected by wide bridges, creating a harbor suitable for war chariots. Its walls were plated with bronze, tin, and a polishable, non-tarnishing red metal. A temple dedicated to the sea god featuring a war chariot with stone sculptures of horses climbing the waves, stood present. Plato allows Critias to tell how the 10 kings judged in brotherhood according to the laws carved on a red column. Details of the hunts, feasts, and the ritual of stern justice applied when the king broke his oath are also included. A prosperity that captivated the soul was bestowed upon the island. However, the voice in the dialogue states that the divine portion in the ruling leaders diminished over time, while the human aspects gradually increased. Appetite replaced virtue, and greed replaced justice. Seeing this, the gods weighed the scales of justice and rendered a decision. The narrative recounts how the ground trembled and the sea swallowed the structures that human pride had raised. The first dialogue concludes with a promise that the cosmos will meet order and the story of an ancient war will be shared. The second dialogue begins to fulfill this promise, describing the land of the river as a province under the rule of the Western power, setting the coasts of Italy as the boundary of their reach.
For Athens, a period of perfect maturity is described, predating the birth of the listeners. The expanse of an empire is equated with the quiet strength of a single city. Yet the narrative breaks off precisely here. The manuscript that reaches us is left in the middle of an unfinished sentence, like an open door that cannot be closed by a sudden wind. A third dialogue might have concluded this story with a fine moral lesson, but it has not survived to the present day. A fourth voice is present at the table, yet it remains silent in the pages we possess. The legend of Atlantis rests on a narrow foundation because Plato left behind only 2 works. It belongs to the group of ancient writers who spoke little but were insufficient to tell a new story. A commentator from late antiquity claimed that one of Plato's students traveled to South Carolina and saw ancient columns with inscriptions similar to this story. A geographer, however, shrugs, questioning this claim. Another historian calls a people living near the Atlas Mountains Atlanteans, but stresses that this has no connection to the island. A poet adds atmosphere when speaking of the Western Sea, but does not plot its physical map. None of these verses can bear the weight of meaning intended for them. Ultimately, the truly valuable expressions belong to Plato. They are neither as concrete as a ship's logbook, nor an ordinary tale. Instead, they are profound and instructive. What is the lesson? Plato was not a man to hide his intentions. He aimed to hold a mirror up to Athens. On one side, he depicted a city faithful to its ancient laws, and on the other, a city where wealth governed its councils. He painted the portrait of a free people standing against a power that confused abundance with virtue. He used the sea, which teaches humility, as the final judge.
He intentionally left the story unfinished so that readers could continue the discussion in their own minds. Is this narrative a true memory passed down from the island, Egypt, and Greece?
Or is it a symbolic parable shaped by marble and salt? While the dialogues allow for both interpretations, the search for the answer is left to the reader. In what kind of city would you want to live? What catastrophe would you fear the most? The destruction from external enemies, or the decay that permeates us from within? Although the philosopher's purpose was moral, the story is strikingly similar to reality. Perhaps this is why its influence endures to this day. Atlas's temple has its doors, its columns, and its list of oaths. It is possible to travel from one harbor to another in memory. The bridges are placed so closely that one can see faces when looking toward the next ring. The fields are measured meticulously, like a tablet. Unique sounds and smells prevail during the bull hunt. You can see the kings hanging their crowns on a nail to sit in the council, and feel that these details make the story unforgettable. These are the kind of subtle details that archaeologists learn not to trust without secondary confirmation over time. The Greeks preserved this story in their libraries. The Egyptians also valued the temple inscriptions and the memories of a king that should be remembered through generations. The sea, meanwhile, guarded its shores and its restlessness. Sailors sailing west were cautious. The chain of transmission was shorter than expected. A priest conveyed the knowledge to Solon.
Solon told it to a friend. That friend, in turn, passed it to his son. Plato gathered all of this into a story built upon cities and souls. However, from that point on, we begin to hear our own voice more than the priest's. Most ancient memories are shaped this way. They come to us through an open door, and then through the door of another thought. Yet none of this diminishes the story's value. For the essence of being human lies here. One people endure loss and shape their memory with stories that teach lessons from the past, warn against pride, and recall order. Another people transform this narrative into a profound dialogue on justice and the tragic ends of arrogant states. Sailors add to it their knowledge of using wide rudders and planning for the muddy arches. Pilgrims sometimes offer their prayers at a shrine on a headland, watching the sunset draw a red line over the low waves. The facts are few and mostly held by philosophers, but the echo transcends centuries. The flood passes, but the story lives on. It is translated into new languages, taking new forms. Sailors preserve this narrative on their long voyages, remembering the dangers of the brown waters. The priests spoke of a fallen column and the silence that followed. On winter nights, merchants would draw circles on cables, debating how a city so close to the sea could survive for so long. Time carried those circles from memories into books. The Greeks entrusted this story to a few pages that would be copied for 2,000 years, generation after generation. Rome read these pages, but paid little heed. The empire was dealing with its own seas to cross and its own ruins to explain. In later ages, people read Plato and wondered if a metaphor truly pointed to a place. In the Middle Ages, cartographers filled the void of the Atlantic with hopeful and cautionary names: Antillia, High Brazil, the island of 7 cities.
These were not Atlantis, but they expressed the yearning for a western shore that would heal an old wound. The Renaissance added self-assurance to this quest. Francis Bacon wrote his New Atlantis, describing a land that valued discovery over ornament. The place he spoke of was not the lost island itself. He described an ideal location where science and reason would flourish. Centuries later, a German merchant read the works of Homer and unearthed Troy. Heinrich Schliemann began excavations in Anatolia with only a shovel and a fierce belief. These excavations illuminated the reality of a city long sought in songs. This success was more impactful than any sermon in bolstering the Atlantis legend. If Troy could spring to life from a poem, why couldn't Plato's island exist from a dialogue? In the 19th century, Congressman Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book that infused the old story with new meanings. To him, Atlantis was the mother of all civilizations. The pyramids in Egypt and the stepped temples in America were echoes of a lost city. He argued that flood myths also traced back to a single catastrophe and location. His book had a more lasting impact than its evidence. It taught readers only to focus on similarities and overlook the real connections. What man could build with stone, water, and belief was forgotten. Other dreamers followed him.
Some transformed Atlantis into a tale of lost races and the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations. Others drew the island into the depths of mysticism, speaking of root races and secret wisdom. But with time, darker faces emerged. Malevolent individuals reshaped the Atlantis legend to suit their ideologies, presenting it to young minds as fantasies based on blood and destiny. As the century ended, optimistic spirits showed great caution when they saw the sign of a perfect city hidden to the west on any map. Although dreamers did not cease writing, the sea was now opening up to eyes that knew its secrets. Technological advancements turned the Atlantic from an unknown into a concrete landscape through drillings and mappings. Marie Tharp mapped the mid-ocean ridge, drawing attention with her work that transformed the entire understanding of the underwater world. Oceanic plates were geologically young formations. The Atlantic seabed was slowly built and reshaped by the heat of fire and the cold pressure. Among these elements, there was no room for the story of a continent that housed cities during the age of man and then completely disappeared beneath the waves. A lost island could be submerged, but a lost continent could not sink. The ocean had aged with the effects of time. The spine of the earth, this structure extending like a backbone, was young and dynamic. Far removed from marble courtyards, it had a completely different nature. Approaching the inner seas, both oars and tools for exploration sought different opportunities. Workers on the island known as Santorini, ancient Thera, encountered painted walls buried under ash while clearing for new constructions.
Streets and rooms remained sealed beneath pumice and dust.
Archaeologists Spiridon Marinatos pioneered the first excavations at Akrotiri, and later Christos Dumas took over these efforts. A Bronze Age town bearing the scars of a terrible volcanic eruption was uncovered in this region. In the abandoned houses, jars were still in the last place they were touched. Frescoes depicted young men catching fish, and scenes with ships and legends were staged. The date of the eruption in the area goes back to the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. The colossal waves generated by the volcanic explosion reached the shores of Crete and beyond. The resulting destruction damaged the Minoan palaces, which eventually fell into the hands of others. The island mentioned in Plato's texts was beyond the known world, yet Thera had lost its existence after some time. Nevertheless, this place once held a wealthy city adorned with intricately crafted ship motifs and bull figures. Many people believed that the stories hidden beneath the volcanic ashes turned into memories that could grow into myths over time. Even Greece itself added small echoes to these rumors. During Plato's youth, the city named Helike was submerged into the depths of the Gulf of Corinth following a dark night of earth and water, and the surviving inhabitants were forced to make a mute start on new shores. The catastrophe was recorded by the writers of that period in the pages of history. Fishermen later reported that they could make out temple columns beneath the clear waters when the sea was calm. Modern archaeologists uncovered the city buried in this alluvial plain, tracing its lost streets. A Greek listening to Plato's narratives might remember Helike and perceive it as real as a Western ocean legend. Other shores held different stories. In the shallow waters of the Bimini area in the Bahamas, divers encountered a regular line of stones resembling a road. Although this discovery initially caused a sensation and turned into a legend, geologists stated it was a work of nature, a coastal structure eroded by waves, fractured by faults, and shaped by time. Near the Strait of Gibraltar, French geologist Jacques Collina-Girard pointed to a landmass known as Spartel that was higher during the Ice Age and now lies beneath the waves west of the strait.
There, he questioned whether a low-lying island could harbor a small community and its people. The idea was quite clear in structure. No evidence for this was found in the swamps beyond the former mouth of the Guadalquivir River. As television crews wandered the Donana Plain, speaking of Tartessos and a muddy city, local archaeologists nodded their heads indifferently and slowly returned to their work. In the Sahara Desert, the Richat structure near Adrar, appearing like a circular scar on the earth, looks like a series of rings from the sky. This natural formation is a dome eroded from rock and salt. a geology lesson delivered with an almost mocking face. However, this formation contains neither a harbor nor a sea. It gathers its believers like the mirages that draw the thirsty in the desert. Science seems to reject legends, yet it has done more than that. It has also taught us patience. Nature has shown how lands were submerged beneath the depths of time, and how the seas today form sand dunes where water once was. It has been described as a silent library, recording storms and calm with an order that no palace has ever shown, with ash and pollen deposits and the shells of tiny creatures hidden in the mud. It was revealed that the Black Sea rapidly rose into a basin where farmers once worked at river mouths. Likewise, the North Sea was discovered to have once been a vast plain covered with fertile reeds and roamed by game animals, known today as Doggerland. These studies reminded us that coastlines are actually transient, and that the reason human memory loves shores is that they are the places where loss is most difficult to forget. Underwater archaeology taught us the patience required when recounting subtle details.
Methods were developed for how to salvage a sunken ship or examine a harbor filled with alluvium. The work proceeded with both a slow and honest approach. Research teams drew maps, took measurements, and carefully unearthed seemingly simple finds: a shoe, a coin, or a faded shirt fragment with the maker's stamp. Through these efforts, harbors known only to inscriptions and storms were discovered. Places that were not cities were never claimed to be cities. In this deep silence, the legend found an opportunity to breathe more purely and clearly. Modern readers continue to oscillate between two thoughts. Some point to Plato, arguing the story is a crafted, symbolic mirror, while others focus on the ash and mud, asserting that lasting legends often begin with real, lived events. The speculations surrounding these approaches range from the cautious to the wildly extravagant. Santorini remains central in these scenarios, not just as an island beyond the strait, but as a powerful and tragic catastrophe carried by words. It is presented as proof that a Greek did not need to reinvent the voice of the earth. The Atlantic, meanwhile, promises valleys that had higher levels in the past and lost coasts, also recalling the small communities that lived in those areas, marked as danger on modern maps. None of this offers us a street where we can step and walk. Rather, it transmits the profound thought of a priest, the atmosphere of a mind that can grasp both home and warning simultaneously. However, there is a common consensus that most expert hands confirm. No archaeologist has discovered a place that can be named Atlantis. A confirmed city that aligns with the dimensions, order, and era described by Plato has not been found. There is no lost empire of marble rising in the Atlantic Ocean. The sea tells us this like a clock ticking in the order of basalt, magnetism, and lava. The island, if it truly lived, could not have been a continent. Its story was filled with details taken from ships, quarries, and the human passion for carving laws onto stone. It was built on measure,
and pride.
Yet the old verses persist. The image of a ringed harbor, a column guarding the law, 10 kings gathered in the grove, remembering their brotherhood, a free city standing alone. That unforgettable night the world turned. These are hard to erase from our memory, for they hold up our mirrors. They make us question what is important and the moments when splendor turns into ostentation. When comfort triumphs over order, when the fleet wears masks that will not obey words for long. It is no surprise that this story is resilient. Perhaps Atlantis's endurance stems from being a narrative device rather than a place. We compare it with our cities, searching for the missing resonance. Thus, this tale continues to transcend time by changing its form. In an ancient Greek dialogue, standing in the shadow of a table, in an island from the Renaissance where science was belief, in a 19th century promise written with the hope that a single city could explain the world, in a 20th century map showing that the ocean floor is not just darkness, but a book waiting to be read, or on the ship depicted on the wall at a crotary, a story where a painter left it there, unaware that the ash would preserve it perfectly for 3,000 years. A refugee family building a temple on a headland, teaching their children to leave a handful of grain on days of good harvest. We might call this a memory, perhaps a legend. Maybe both are true. It does not matter. The only simple truth that remains to us is this: pride also has its tides. If the bridges are not repaired, order can be disrupted, and the sea is non-negotiable. The people who survive are those who can uphold their laws even when the land breaks apart. Perhaps this is the island's final gift, hidden in the past of the West. The ability to tell us how to look at our own shores and what the world might choose to love and preserve from us. It teaches us to calculate what the seas offer, but in this case, what can truly surface.